It's colder here than anywhere else on Earth. Yet somehow, it's also where the world is starting to burn. I guess that makes sense in a sick kind of way. After all, change rarely comes where you expect it. I've always loved the cold, the quiet. I thought of Antarctica like a distant paradise, untouched by centuries of civilization. But that was before the ice started to melt, before the old things hidden deep beneath the glaciers began to stir, before I knew what fear really was. I guess I should start by telling you who I am, or rather, who I was. My name's Mark. I was a 29-year-old virologist stationed at McKinley Outpost, a remote research station about 200 kilometers inland from what used to be one of Antarctica's largest ice shelves. Climate change and shifting ocean currents are starting to do the unimaginable. Part of the continent's icy armour is receding, leaving behind patches of bare earth and stone. Nature has been busy, unearthing secrets older than anything we'd ever encountered. People like me, scientists with a taste for the unknown, have flocked down here, excited to see what treasures might emerge from the ancient permafrost. Fossils maybe, strange microbes, data that could reshape our understanding of life's history. But I can't pretend I was entirely pure of motive. I also wanted some kind of intellectual glory. Maybe discover a virus that lay dormant for millennia, study it, understand the epochs of life. At the time, it seemed romantic. Now, all I want to do is forget. We were a crew of 8. Myself, Dr. Cohen, our lead paleobiologist, Santos, the geologist, Lynn, the climatologist, Dembe, a field technician with a mechanical genius, Rafik, a paleontologist, Olivier, our station medic, and Elena, the botanist. And, of course, Adam, my best friend and our logistical coordinator. We weren't stationed there for glory alone. We had a job. To survey newly exposed ground and catalogue whatever we could. Most of the team were veterans of polar missions, but this was my first long stint. I remember our arrival, how excited I was stepping off the transport plane, looking at a horizon of shimmering ice and newly revealed brown rock. We were the first people to lay eyes on that land in millions of years. I wish we never had. We found it about 3 weeks in. It was late November, summer in Antarctica. The sun never really set, just hovered on the horizon, painting the snowscape in perpetual twilight. By then, the patch of land we were studying had grown from a small rocky outcrop to an entire valley of recently exposed earth. Sublimation and melt had revealed sediment layers that no human had ever touched. The day we made the discovery, I was out with Cohen and Rafik. Our small tracked vehicle trundled along a muddy slope. Mud in Antarctica, I know. Everything was wrong about that image. Rafik was beside himself with excitement. Cohen kept shaking his head, muttering that we'd have better luck further down, where some icy rivulets were cutting through the sediment. We found an exposed cavity in the ground, a cave mouth framed by half-melted ice and dripping water. The ice had formed a natural vault, sealing something inside it for who knows how long. As the climate shifted, that vault had cracked open. Water pooled at the entrance, creating a kind of natural doorway into darkness. We decided to take a look, just a quick peek. Cohen took the lead. Rafik and I followed, shining our headlamps into the gloom. Inside, the floor was uneven, slick with meltwater. Strange mineral formations hung from the ceiling. It smelled stale, but not foul, at least not at first. As we ventured deeper, maybe 30 meters in, we found a section where the ice had formed a crystalline wall. Beneath that thin layer of frost, I saw something dark and organic. I felt odd for reasons I still can't explain. Something about it felt unnatural. Rafik crouched, scraping gently at the ice. Cohen hissed at him to be careful. But the damage was done. Our warm breath, our headlamps and body heat in that sealed chamber began to melt the delicate frost coating. What emerged behind the thinning ice was a mass of tangled shapes. At first, I thought they were roots, or perhaps petrified plants. But as more of the frost sloughed away, I knew it was something else. Bones. Long, twisted bones that didn't match any creature I knew. Cohen's breath stopped. He whispered something about not fitting known classifications. He snapped pictures with trembling hands. Rafik did the same. I just stood there, transfixed by the half-buried skeleton. It looked contorted, as if its limbs had too many joints. The skull, if that's what it was, seemed bulbous, with ridges where eyes might have been. We should have left right then. We should have packed up and never looked back. Instead, we collected a few ice core samples near that strange fossil and returned to base, our minds racing with curiosity and excitement. That night, back at McKinley Outpost, I examined a meltwater sample under a microscope. I was hoping to find some trace of ancient microbes. At first glance, the sample looked disappointingly mundane. But as I adjusted the focus and added a fluorescent dye, I noticed something moving. A faint, erratic flicker. Tiny viral particles, perhaps, hidden among the melting permafrost microbes. I isolated them, curious. They were odd, larger than normal viruses, with strange segmented areas. I labelled the sample TV-19. I didn't know what it would do. How could I? The next days were a whirlwind. Word had spread among us about the fossil. Cohen and Rafik argued quietly about classification. Santos tried to match the surrounding geology, muttering about sediment layers that indicated a time frame millions of years old, predating known Antarctic ecosystems. Lynn worried about pathogens, but Olivier, our medic, insisted we'd be fine if we took standard precautions. He was methodical, but maybe too confident. Elena mostly kept to herself, pressing plants brought in from the thawed ground between sheets of plastic. And Adam, bless him, tried to keep everyone's spirits up, making coffee and jokes, telling me that we'd become famous for this discovery. I kept studying the virus. Over 2 days, its activity increased when I warmed the sample to human body temperature. I noticed how it latched onto common bacteria, hijacking their cells. It was aggressive, unstoppable. I remember telling Olivier that we should be careful, and he just nodded, agreeing to establish stricter quarantine measures for all of our samples. We had suits and masks. We just got complacent. A few days later, one of our storage units malfunctioned. The power fluctuated. Dembe had warned us the backup generator was acting up. The brief temperature rise in the containment fridge might have allowed the virus to replicate. I was the first to notice the error. I rushed to fix it, fumbling with the panels. When I opened the fridge, I felt a whoosh of slightly warmer air. Without thinking, I inhaled sharply, startled by a sudden drop in a test tube. I didn't realize I'd just inhaled the future of my nightmares. At first, nothing happened. I was fine. My mind was on other things. Elena and Rafik had gone back to the cave to take more samples. Cohen was analysing the photos of the skeleton, trying to piece together what it could be. Adam and Santos were out checking a nearby melt pool for microorganisms. But the next morning, I woke with a headache and a weird taste in my mouth, metallic and sour. My throat felt tight. I figured it was just the dry air, maybe a mild cold. I took some aspirin and went about my day. Olivier noticed I was pale, but didn't comment. He was busy with Cohen, who'd cut his hand opening a crate. Just a small cut, nothing serious. That afternoon, Elena and Rafik returned from the cave. They were soaked, tired, and strangely quiet. Elena particularly seemed disturbed. When I inquired, she shook her head. "We found more remains," she said softly. "Not just one skeleton, many, all twisted and fused, not like animals, something else." Her voice cracked. Rafik just stared at the floor. He wouldn't talk to me at all. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came that night. We were all in the mess hall, trying to maintain a semblance of normal routine. A pot of rehydrated stew, stale crackers, weak coffee. I sat at the table, eyes drifting over my colleagues' faces. Cohen was hunched over, still rubbing his bandaged hand. Lynn tapped her fingers nervously on the steel tabletop. Adam gave me a worried glance, noticing my silence. Then Elena suddenly stood up, knocking her chair backwards. It clattered loud enough to make us all jump. Her face was flushed, her breathing heavy. She clutched her chest, tears forming in her eyes. "I feel hot," she gasped. "Something's wrong." Before Olivier could reach her, she collapsed onto the floor, convulsing. Her eyes rolled back, and foam flecked her lips. I rushed over with Olivier, my heart pounding. We tried to hold her still. She felt scorching to the touch, as if a fever had raged to life inside her in mere seconds. Olivier yelled for a medkit. Adam darted to fetch it, while the rest of us formed a helpless circle, watching our colleagues spasm. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the fit stopped. Elena lay there, breathing shallowly. Olivier and I hoisted her up and carried her to the infirmary. Lynn followed, while the others stayed back, stunned. We spent the next hour trying to stabilize her. She screamed in delirium, her eyes unfocused. I tried to talk to her, to calm her down. She only whispered nonsense. "They're hungry. They're so hungry. I heard them in the dark." After a massive dose of antipyretics and sedatives, she finally slipped into a restless sleep. Olivier stepped back, breathing heavily, his forehead creased. "Some kind of infection," he said. "Her temperature's off the charts. I've never seen anything like it." I thought about the virus, about my samples, about our lax protocols. I said nothing, but guilt gnawed at me. I needed to check for viral markers, but first, I had to see if anyone else was showing symptoms. By the next morning, Elena's condition worsened. Strange lesions formed on her back and neck, blackish and raised. She scratched at them, drawing blood. Olivier tried antiviral meds that we had on hand, experimental stuff. No improvement. If anything, it seemed to agitate her. She hissed and moaned in her half-conscious state, muttering again about hunger, about things moving beneath the ice. I worked feverishly in the lab, scanning blood samples under the microscope. What I saw made my blood run colder than any Antarctic wind. The virus I'd isolated, TV-19, was everywhere in her bloodstream. It was replicating at a staggering rate, mutating cells, stripping away normal human structures. It attacked her DNA like a parasite, rewriting a host's identity. I ran more tests and realized something horrific. The virus didn't just kill cells, it transformed them. Her cells were changing shape, sprouting strange roots. Muscle cells broke down and then reformed into something else. Fibers with odd crystallizations inside. The virus was making her different. I reported my findings to the group. Olivier's eyes were haunted. Adam placed a trembling hand on my shoulder. Cohen tried to deny it. "This is impossible," he yelled. But we could all see Elena's body rejecting human normalcy. She looked thinner, but her muscles twitched with unnatural strength. She snapped at Olivier when he tried to take another sample, biting at the air like an animal. Rafik and Santos were missing from breakfast. They'd left early to recheck the fossil site. Without telling anyone, they'd taken the second vehicle. That worried me. What if they were infected too? Who knew how the virus spread? Through the air, contact, or something else? We tried to radio them. No answer. The storm outside had worsened. High winds and blowing snow battered the outpost. The weather window we'd enjoyed was closing fast, trapping us with our newfound nightmare. By midday, Elena had slipped into a kind of coma, her eyes half open but unseeing, her limbs rigid. Olivier insisted on restraining her to the bed for her own safety. Dembe quietly asked if we should take other measures. No one wanted to think about that. Murdering a colleague, it was unthinkable. But I caught Adam's eye. We shared a look. We both knew how bad this was. That evening, Santos and Rafik returned. Or rather, something returned wearing their coats. They stumbled through the door, pale and shaking. We rushed to greet them, relief turning to horror as we saw their faces. Both men had lesions similar to Elena's. Their eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated and oddly shaped, as if something tugged at their very biology. They slurred their words, babbling nonsense about a sinkhole near the cave and shapes moving beneath the ground. They mentioned singing, low humming from the earth. Then they both collapsed. We dragged them to the infirmary, placing them in beds opposite Elena. Now we had 3 infected, all in various stages of transformation. Olivier did all he could, IV fluids, antiviral attempts, sedation. Nothing worked. The virus marched on in them, remaking their flesh. The rest of us, me, Adam, Cohen, Lynn and Dembe, huddled in the mess hall. The lights flickered as the wind screamed outside. We discussed options. Quarantine was obvious. Lock down the infected in the infirmary. But what if they broke out? Dembe suggested barricading the door. Cohen shook his head, horrified at the thought of treating colleagues like dangerous animals. Lynn cried softly, saying this could get out to the world if we ever returned home. That was the worst realization. What if we couldn't contain this? We were remote, yes, but supply ships and planes would eventually come. If the virus spread beyond us, what dark hell would we unleash on humanity? I felt dizzy, nauseated. My own throat was still sore. I coughed quietly into my sleeve, hoping no one else noticed. The following day, Elena changed. We awoke to screams from the infirmary. Cohen had gone to check on them early. We rushed after him. Inside, I saw Elena upright in her bed, free of her restraints. The straps had snapped. She hissed, baring teeth that looked sharper than before. Black lesions covered half of her face. Cohen stood frozen, and she lunged at him. He screamed as she knocked him into the supply cabinets, glass shattering. Olivier yelled and tried to pull her off, only to be met with inhuman strength. I watched, paralysed by terror, as she bent Cohen's arm backwards with a sickening crack. His cries curdled my blood. Dembe and Adam rushed forward. Adam grabbed a fire extinguisher and slammed it into Elena's shoulder. She screeched, stumbling back. Her eyes fixated on Adam, and for a moment, I swore she recognized him. She shook her head as if confused, and then snarled. Olivier pulled Cohen clear, dragging him outside into the corridor. I picked up a chair, ready to defend myself. Lynn stood behind me, sobbing. Elena advanced slowly, limping now, her body twisting and stretching in ways I hadn't seen before. Behind her, I saw Rafik and Santos stirring on their beds, their bodies jerking as the virus roused them from sleep. We couldn't let them all turn. We'd be overrun. "Get out!" I screamed to the others, inching towards the door. Adam nodded, pushing Lynn ahead. Dembe held the fire extinguisher like a club. We backed out, and as we did, Rafik rolled off of his bed, landing on all fours like a beast. He was changing too. The bones in his neck jutted out, a grinding sound accompanying the unnatural posture. Once we were in the corridor, Dembe slammed the infirmary door shut. Adam and I shoved a heavy equipment cart against it. Inside, we heard furious banging and scraping. They were trapped. For now. We were left with Cohen's moans echoing in the sterile hallway. Olivier tore open his shirt, checking his broken arm. Cohen's face was bloodless, shock setting in. "We need splints, painkillers," Olivier said. His voice shook. "She broke his arm like a twig." I knelt beside them, shaking. Cohen would need medical attention, but we had to be careful. Any contact with infected blood, any droplets, could spread this. "Olivier," I said softly, "do you think, can he be infected now?" She scratched him. There was blood. Olivier looked at me with forlorn eyes. "I don't know." He applied disinfectant and bandages, working quickly as Cohen passed out from the pain. We carried him to the lounge, clearing a couch. Lynn hovered anxiously. Dembe paced the corridor, holding the extinguisher like it was a shotgun. Adam sat against the wall, head in his hands. I coughed again, a deep, chesty cough. I felt hot, sweat trickling down my spine. Unbridled fear wrapped itself around my heart. No, not me. Not now. We decided that we had to leave. It sounded ridiculous. The area's weather was worsening, and our tracked vehicles might not survive a long journey to the nearest station. But staying meant certain death, and worse, release of this horror into the world. We had to isolate ourselves or find help. Dembe argued we should try and radio McMurdo station. Adam reminded him that McMurdo was too far. No one would get there in time. Lynn wanted to destroy the infected right now, set fire to the infirmary, but we had no reliable flamethrowers or weapons. Olivier refused to even consider killing them. They'd been our colleagues. My head pounded. I drifted away from the conversation, nausea and fever swirling inside me. The virus was inside me. I knew it. I'd tested my own blood in secret that morning, just a quick smear under the microscope. I saw the viral particles writhing in my cells. I was a ticking time bomb. I didn't tell the others. Maybe I should have. But I was scared. Scared of what they might do to me. Scared that I'd become a monster that would tear them apart. That night, the infirmary door rattled. We could hear the infected clawing at it. The wood splintered. The equipment cart shifted. They were getting stronger. Cohen woke up briefly, delirious with fever. Olivier and I exchanged a glance. Another one infected. Soon, he'd be joining them. We hatched a desperate plan. We'd load one of the tracked vehicles with supplies, drive out as far as we could. It might mean death by exposure, but at least we'd die as humans. Maybe we could circle back, find another outpost. Or maybe just drive into the white nothingness until we froze, taking the virus with us. But first, we had to deal with our infected colleagues. Letting them roam free was unthinkable. If they escaped the building after we left, they might migrate, survive somehow, or stay dormant until rescue crews arrived. Then, the virus would spread beyond Antarctica, beyond control. I remember looking at Adam and seeing the pain in his eyes. He wanted no part in killing anyone. He was gentle by nature, but we both knew what had to be done. We divided tasks. Lynn and Dembe would gather fuel and rig something to burn the infirmary. Olivier and Adam would prep the vehicle and pack rations. I said I'd help Lynn, but first I sneaked into the lab. I needed to check something. Any last-ditch cure. Anything. My fever was getting worse. My hands shook as I pipetted chemicals. The virus was resistant to anything we were throwing at it. It didn't respond to heat shocks or antivirals. It just adapted, evolving rapidly. It was impossible. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel. My eyes were bloodshot. Black specks dotted the skin at my collarbone. It would happen to me soon. My limbs would twist. My mind would slip away. I couldn't let that happen outside these walls. I grabbed a syringe and filled it with a sedative, enough to knock me out permanently if I wanted. An escape hatch if I lost control. The screaming started then. I rushed out to the corridor. The infirmary door had burst open. Rafik and Santos were free, crawling out. Their bodies were partially human, partially something else. Twisted spines hunched beneath torn clothing. Their eyes glowed with a maddened hunger. Elena emerged behind them, her jaw unhinged, drool mixed with blood dripping down her chin. Dembe yelled and swung the fire extinguisher, connecting with Santos's head. The creature shrieked, but barely flinched. It grabbed Dembe's arm and yanked, sending him sprawling. Lynn hurled a canister of ethanol at Rafik, which shattered and doused him. She flicked on a lighter. Where she found it I'll never know, and tossed it forward. Flames erupted, causing Rafik to screech, the stench of burning flesh filling the corridor. Elena lunged at me. I stepped back, absolutely terrified. She reached out with lengthened fingers, nails like claws. I raised the syringe, my only weapon. As she came close, I jabbed it into her neck and pressed the plunger. She roared, swatting me aside. The syringe might have no effect, but maybe it would slow her down. Adam rushed in, wielding a metal pole. He struck Elena from behind, distracting her. Olivier tried to pull Dembe free from Santos's grip. I saw Lynn trying desperately to keep the flames confined, but now the corridor was thick with smoke. The alarms shrieked. I coughed, choking on smoke, my fever raging. I retreated into a side room. My head was spinning. I heard Dembe scream. I heard Adam shout my name. Guilt and terror wrestled in my chest. Moments later, Adam dragged me out, coughing. "We have to go," he said, voice cracking. "They've killed Dembe." Lynn appeared behind him, tears streaking her soot-smudged face. Olivier was nowhere in sight. We stumbled to the storage bay where the tracked vehicle waited. Cohen was there, slumped against the crate, breathing raggedly. He looked up at us, his eyes sunken. "I'm infected," he said softly. "I can feel it." He picked up a flare gun and pointed it towards him, hands shaking. "Go," he whispered. "Go now." I ran, half limping, one arm over Adam's shoulders. Lynn followed. The screams and animal shrieks echoed from behind. As we boarded the vehicle, I heard a muffled pop. Cohen's flare gun. I hoped he found a quick end. Adam revved the engine. The storm had eased slightly, but visibility was poor. The heavy treads rolled over slush and ice, heading into the unknown. We left behind McKinley Outpost, now burning. Flames flickered in the rearview mirror as we crawled away. Inside the cab, silence reigned except for the rumble of the engine. Adam looked straight ahead, his eyes moist with tears. I coughed again. I felt the virus gnawing at my insides. My skin itched. I thought about telling them. I almost did. But what good would it do? They'd be forced to kill me or leave me behind. And we were in the middle of nowhere. If I jumped out, the virus would freeze with me, locked in my corpse. That might have been the best solution. But I was a coward. I wanted a few more minutes of life. It's funny how much you subconsciously cling to life when you know it's going to soon be wrenched away. We travelled until our fuel gauge dipped low. We reached a stretch of barren rock, a place that the ice had only recently abandoned. Lynn's sobs had quieted. Adam's face was ghostly white. He noticed me shivering and asked me if I was okay. I lied, said it was just nerves. We stopped the vehicle near a ridge. The wind blasted across exposed stone. Adam proposed we set up a small camp, try the radio, attempt contact one last time. If we got no answer, we'd find a crevasse and bury ourselves in the virus forever. I could see the anguish in his eyes. Lynn went outside to set the radio antenna. Adam stayed with me in the cab. I sat in the passenger seat, every muscle aching. Black lesions marred my neck. He hadn't noticed, or maybe he was in denial. I reached into my pocket and felt the empty syringe casing. I had no sedative left. My vision blurred. I tried to focus on Adam's voice as he spoke softly about better days, about how we once thought Antarctica was a frontier of knowledge, not horror. He apologised for not protecting me, as if it was his fault. I felt a hunger building inside of me. My nails scraped the seat. I bit my lip until it bled, trying to keep control. I realised that this was it. I had maybe minutes before I'd lose my mind. I reached for the door handle. "Mark?" Adam asked, confused. I opened the door, stepping out into the bitter cold. The wind whipped at my face. I stumbled into the open, knees weak. I heard Adam calling my name behind me, but I walked faster. I didn't want him to see what I'd become. Lynn was setting up the antenna about 20 meters away. She looked up, startled, as I approached. I saw suspicion in her eyes. She noticed my gait, my posture. I tried to smile reassuringly, but probably failed. She reached for a wrench on the ground, holding it like a weapon. I stopped a few paces from her. I could feel the virus rushing through my veins, screaming at me to feed, to spread. My fingers twitched. I managed to speak, voice rough. "Lynn, back away. I'm infected." Her face went as pale as the ice. She shouted for Adam. I shook my head, tears freezing on my cheeks. "Don't come closer," I rasped. "I'll kill you if you do. The virus. I can't control it." My throat burned. The wind howled. I made a decision, the only one I had left. I turned and ran, stumbling down a slope of loose gravel and ice. I heard Adam yell, felt his footsteps behind me, but I pushed on. My limbs ached, bones grinding as they began to reshape. I wouldn't let the monster take them. I reached a thin patch of ice bridging a crevasse. Perfect. The ice sheet was fragile, already melting at the edges. Without hesitation, I jumped onto it. The sheet cracked, spiderweb fractures shooting across its surface. I stepped again, harder this time, even as pain rippled through my body. I glanced back and saw Adam at the ridge, horror on his face. I forced a smile, or tried to. He reached out, screaming my name. I raised a trembling hand in goodbye. Then I stomped my foot down. The ice gave way. I plummeted into darkness, cold air rushing past me. The crevasse walls blurred. The virus screamed in my veins, but I knew soon the cold and the impact would end me. End it. As I fell, I imagined the old Antarctica, frozen and pristine, long before human hands touched it. Before monsters and viruses and ancient bones. I imagined my colleagues as they were, laughing over coffee, excited about discovering something new. I hoped Adam and Lynn would survive, find a way to warn the world. They were better people than me, braver. They might find peace. The darkness closed in. The wind roared, and somewhere, I swore I heard that ancient hunger crying out, furious at being denied its prey. But it would die with me down here, frozen beneath the ice that once concealed it. I hope the world never knows what truly happened. If you found this record, these words I've somehow managed to record in my last moments, then please, heed them. This virus, this thing we unearthed, must never escape the polar deserts. It belongs in the Earth's ancient tomb. Let it remain a secret, forgotten beneath the endless cold. But if you're the poor soul who's found this, run. It might be too late, but for the love of all that's alive, run. My wife Laura and I moved to Haydenfield in late May of this year. Neither of us knew too much about the town before we moved in. Laura was a travelling nurse and decided it was finally time to settle down at an actual clinic and get more sustainable hours. Haydenfield just happened to be the closest town and had the most affordable houses near her clinic. As for me, I just create mock-ups of websites for different companies. All of my work is done wherever my computer is, so I really didn't mind moving wherever Laura felt happiest with. So when Laura told me about Haydenfield, I was just as excited as she was. The whole town basically consisted of a small subdivision with a connected cul-de-sac. The only other building being a small family-owned department store down the road. It was a retirement town, with the average age being well into their late 60s and 70s. It was quiet, old and secluded, surrounded by a beautifully dense woodland. It was perfect for just the two of us. Our house was a 2-story continental, nestled right into the centre of the main cul-de-sac. It had a bit of age to its design, but it was well kept and maintained. Besides, it was a cheap buy too. The previous owner had passed away from natural causes a few months prior. Her name was Nancy. She made it to 73. The in-home death didn't bother us very much. Seeing death was part of Laura's occupation. And for me, I guess the thought of death never really bothered me that much. Our move-in date was a pretty standard affair. Our whole previous life had fit into a mid-sized storage van, We started unpacking our belongings from the van sometime in the early afternoon that day. It wasn't until the late evening that we had all the boxes inside our new home. To see all of our lives' possessions laying on the floor and not even filling up a single empty living room left us feeling a bit odd. I'd like to say it was the feeling of hope and excitement for having a new start, but in reality, it was that sense of feeling you'd get when you realised that all of your worldly possessions really meant nothing when properly laid out. Yet instead of dealing with that foreboding sense of dread, it's easier to just collect more clutter, to pretend your life has more substance than it actually does. That's what we both agreed on anyway. Once the unpacking was finished, we kicked back on our tiny little sofa. We were on a little island of boxes in an otherwise empty living room. We didn't have too much to say to each other that night. The long day of shepherding boxes from one place to another left us both exhausted. It was right about that time when we'd finally closed our eyes that we heard a knock on the door. It took me a few seconds, but I forced myself up. I could feel my back crack just under my skin at every little movement. I knew I'd be sore for a while, but I still pressed on to my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled open the thick wooden frame. "Hello, neighbour," a voice had filtered out towards me. It was an aged voice with the consistency of sandpaper. My eyes locked with the gaze of my visitor. It was just an elderly old man. His face was weathered, with deep canyons and valleys of wrinkles. Deep shadows of the setting sun cast his face in black silhouettes that displayed the contours of his age. He wore an ebony black, wide-brimmed hat with a dark overcoat that hung over his slender shoulders. He smiled with all of the effort it took for a man who'd already hit that venerable old age of carelessness. "Hey, sorry, we just moved in," I replied. "I don't think we've met yet. Is there anything I can do for you?" I asked the senior. He just shook his head in steady dismissal. No, nothing like that. I just wanted to give you a proper welcome to Hydenfield. The name's John Clark. I'm the block president here." He extended one of his lanky hands towards me. I took his hand in mine and shook it. His skin felt like tanned leather, but his grip was strong. "Well, thanks for the welcome. Sorry we didn't have time to meet with the neighbours yet. We've had a pretty busy day." John tightened his lips and nodded in understanding. "Nonsense. We should be apologising to you. Had we been younger, we'd have helped you out with those boxes. I think those times are long past us now, though." John gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Listen, we pride ourselves in this town for our hospitality. If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. My wife Mary and I love having company, and we live in that blue house right next door." I gave a small, tired smile back to the old man. "Thanks, John. I'll pass that on to my wife." "Good. Tell you the truth, none of us even lock our doors at night. I promise you, if you need anything at all, just walk right in." His smile faltered, with just a twitch at the end of his words. His eyes focused deep into mine. "Well, I appreciate that offer. I promise we'll knock first, though." I gave a half-hearted laugh. The old man's expression didn't change. "Whatever makes you feel more comfortable here. Just remember, always keep hospitality first. Around here, we're all guests within each other's homes." He squeezed my hand tightly, making me realise that he'd never let go of me in the first place. Be safe. His leathery hand tightened over mine one last time before he let go. The old man dipped his chin slightly in a small bow of respect, his wide-brim hat dipping below his eyes and casting his face into total darkness. Our doors are open for you, Gregory, at any time, no matter the hour. And with that, John swung around and turned back towards my driveway. His black overcoat billowed off of his small frame with beautiful grace. I squinted my eyes towards him, trying to find the words to the strange feeling I had over the situation. Something about that interaction had given me a terribly uncomfortable feeling. I couldn't place my finger on it though. I slowly shut the door and locked the deadbolt behind the old man. I shook off the nerves that tumbled down my spine and returned back to the barren living room of my new home. Laura had found herself laying half asleep on the couch, her body sprawled across the cushions. "Who was that?" her small voice murmured out towards me. "A neighbour. His name's John. He lives in that blue house right next to ours with his wife." Laura twisted her body and stretched out on the empty couch, yawning. Her voice pushed past her inhale. "Oh, was he nice?" she asked through her tired tone. "Yeah, he just seems a little strange." I paused for a moment, judging how much space was left on the couch past Laura's small frame. "Hey, let's head upstairs before we both pass out down here. Otherwise, one of us is going to end up sleeping on the floor." Laura laughed before pushing herself up. We both went upstairs to our unfurnished bedroom. The only thing we'd set up was a queen-size box spring with a matching mattress that lay on top of it. The box spring had found itself laying haphazardly on the hardwood of our floor. We ended up both sluggishly making our usual nest of pillows and blankets. Before long, we were both blacked out for the night. It wasn't until a few hours later I felt a pressure on my chest that was shaking me awake. I looked over to the small silhouette of Laura next to me. The silvery moonlight from our window casting an ethereal light over her figure. "Greg, wake up!" Laura's voice sounded panicked and subdued. I could hear how terrified she was, even underneath her hushed tone. What's going on?" I replied. My hand had tried to wipe away the sleep from my eyes. My body still felt exhausted from the physical labour we'd just finished. "I heard the downstairs door slam shut. I think someone broke in." I looked at Laura and held my breath. I was trying to hear if anything else in our home was making noise. All I could hear was the throbbing of my own heart. The rest of the house was dead quiet. There hadn't been a single creak of the floorboards. "I'll go check it out," I whispered over to Laura. She let go of my chest and I lurched myself upwards. I wished I had a gun or a bat or anything I could have used to defend myself with. But I had nothing more than the mattress on the floor. But I swallowed that feeling and pressed on. I slowly opened up my bedroom door and crept downstairs. Nearly every step I took sent a loud creak that echoed its way throughout the empty house. I kept telling myself that nothing could be inside our home and be this silent. Not unless it was standing completely still. I entered our moonlit living room and flipped on the lights. Nothing. I pressed forward into the kitchen and did the same thing. Nothing. Finally, the foyer. Still nothing. I looked over to the front door and saw the deadbolt latch still flipped towards the locked position. I felt my body relax, my shoulders slumping down in relief. I took a deep breath and wandered back up into our bedroom. There's no one down there. The door's still locked. Laura just stared at me for a moment. I know what I heard, Greg. Someone slammed that door shut. I could see the absolute resolve in Laura's eyes. I knew that she fully believed in what she'd heard. Listen, I don't know. Everything's locked up tight down there. No one's getting in without breaking down that door. I laid back down on the mattress next to my wife. She just stared towards our bedroom door, as if she expected something to break right through it. Both of our physical fatigues ended up hitting their limits a few moments later, and we found ourselves asleep once again. But the same surprise came again and again, night after night. Laura would wake me up sometime after 2 a.m. and tell me that she heard our front door slam shut. I'd head downstairs, see nothing, and check the lock to find everything in order. It wasn't until the evening of the fourth night, well after we'd finished moving in, that I made a disturbing discovery with our door. The lock didn't actually work. The deadbolt didn't transition over, no matter how hard you twisted the locking mechanism. The door had been unlocked every single night since we'd first moved in. I was at a crossroads. I could break the news to Laura and have her lose even more sleep than she'd already lost, or just make the decision to handle things myself and buy a new bolt from the department store in the morning. So I did what I thought was best. I told Laura that I'd sleep on the couch that night and keep an eye on the door. I didn't tell her about the broken lock. She went upstairs to our bedroom while I laid down on our couch. I decided to grab a kitchen knife for protection, just in case. I stole the largest one I could find from our knife set. It was about the deadliest thing I could think of. I positioned our couch so it faced our foyer. My vision was dead set on our front door for the first few hours. I did my best to keep my eyes open that night, but a few hours in, and they felt heavy. My mind had found itself halfway to dreamland and halfway to reality. So when I watched the dimly lit front door in front of me slowly crack its way open, I couldn't muster up the energy to move. Even when my brain had begun to scream at me to do something, my body was paralyzed. I could only watch as the brass handle of the door slowly unlatched itself, and the thick wooden door creaked its way open. The darkness from outside had spilled forward. The shadows cast an uncanny black shade throughout the foyer. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't make out a single figure in the emptiness of the void outside. But I could see one thing. I could see an arm that had extended its lanky fingers around the exterior of our doorknob. It was gangly, with a pale red hue that seemed unnaturally coloured. Spindles of blackened veins intertwined themselves with knots of tumour-like growths all along its skin. The arm was so thin it could be mistaken for a discarded tree branch. Yet, the thing's arm was impossibly long for its slender and atrophied frame. The forearm alone had to have been at least 4 or 5 feet in length. Its upper arm was even more so. The limbs stretched deep into the darkness of the night outside. I couldn't even see the shoulder that the stick-like appendage should have been connected to. The entirety of the creature's body was completely cloaked in the shadows from outside. Meanwhile, I watched helplessly as the door creaked its way more and more open. The door had nearly reached the limits of its hinges before it paused. A few seconds passed before the fingers of the creature had tightened around the brass door handle. With a single tug, the door flew backwards. The full force of the wood slammed shut with such an impact that the intensity of it alone shook the house. I finally snapped out of my paralysis. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat pour down my forehead. I heard my bedroom door bang open, and the thudding of my wife's feet sprint downstairs towards me. "Greg!" she yelled out as soon as she saw me. I looked at her and knew immediately that she could see the expression on my face. The absolutely petrified expression. "Greg, what happened? Did you see anything?" I couldn't formulate the words out of my mouth. I just nodded. We stayed up the whole night with each other. As soon as the department store opened, I made the drive over. Funnily enough, the local store didn't sell any type of door lock. But ever determined, I drove out the extra hour to a chain store and got exactly what I needed. By the early afternoon, I was taking off my old deadbolt and affixing on the new one. My tired mind was barely able to comprehend the task I was doing. "Hello, neighbour," a raspy voice had called out from behind me. I turned towards the blistering sun and saw the outline of John wearing his wide brim hat right behind me. "What are you doing?" I sighed and continued on. "I'm fixing up our locks. I just noticed last night that they weren't working." I pushed my fingertips against my eyelids and tried to force some of my exhaustion out. "I wouldn't worry about that. None of us ever lock up our doors." John continued to stare down at me. I couldn't make out his expression through the blinding light that backlit his slender figure. "Yeah, well, I'd just feel safer if I did," I muttered to myself. I grabbed the new lock and placed it into the now empty hole of the front door. "You won't be. The hospitality of an open door policy is what keeps this neighbourhood safe. Always has been, ever since I was a kid. A lot of people had to get hurt to realise that." A silence enveloped us as I continued about my task. "Gregory, if you finish what you're doing, you're going to get yourself and your wife hurt. Now I can't say much more than that, but you need to trust in your neighbours." I scoffed under my breath before I turned towards John. I created a visor for my eyes using my hands. The makeshift shade helped me see the dour expression on my neighbour's face. "Listen, John, I get it. You're a close community here. But we've been having issues with our front door opening since we got here. That's stopping tonight." John slowly shook his head in disappointment. "I can't compel someone to have good manners. Compelled hospitality is no hospitality on behalf of the compulsor. I'd be damned if I forced your hand here. But there are things out there that don't like locked doors. They've got to feel welcomed, otherwise our whole neighbourhood falls apart." I felt my brow furrow as I looked closer at John's face. I felt a kinship of understanding between us. I felt like he knew more than he was letting on. "What's going on here?" I whispered up to the old man. "It's unbecoming to talk about someone behind their back." He paused. "Mary's making a pie for you tonight. I'll leave it on your doorstep. Don't eat it. It's for your guests tonight." John took a deep breath and muttered, "I hope it'll be enough," under his breath. The old man swung his back towards me and began to walk back towards his house. I ignored him and fixed up the door. I made sure it was locked up tight as soon as I was finished. Sure enough, just a few hours after Laura had returned home, we had a knock on our door. I opened it and discovered a large, steaming, fresh cherry pie. It had found its home resting upon our stoop. A small card lay near it. It read, "For the guests of Gregory and Laura Adams, from the neighbourhood of Haydenfield. We apologise for making you feel unwelcome tonight. Please accept our deepest apologies. Very respectfully, the Clarks. P.S. Gregory, a proper dessert should always be set out on your kitchen table, in case any guests make an unexpected visit. May you have room on your dining room table to place this, in case that may happen. God bless, John." Laura and I both gave each other a strange glance. "What's that all about?" she asked, flipping the card around in her hand. "No idea," I replied, examining the pie in my hands. The aroma wafted over our home in the most pleasant of ways. "Should we have a slice?" Laura leaned down and smelled the tart cherry scent that had emanated from the juices inside. I pulled it away from her. Something in me told me that John knew something that we didn't. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew what the card said, and I knew what I'd seen the night before. "Let's just leave it on the table tonight. We can double check with the neighbours tomorrow, just to make sure they actually made it. Otherwise, I don't know if we can trust it, you know." I tried my best to explain it away, but Laura gave me a skeptical look. Thankfully, she just shrugged it off. I placed the card and the pie right on the centre of the dining room table and headed upstairs. Laura managed to fall asleep before I did. That night, I felt my eyes stare deep holes into my eyelids. No sense of drowsiness had washed over me. I could only think of that strange, spindly arm that I'd seen the prior night. Like clockwork, just after 2 a.m, I heard a jingle come from my downstairs foyer. The doorknob was shaking. It was slow at first, but then got more frantic. I gripped onto my bed covers and prayed that the lock would keep whatever that thing was away. But as the door handle jiggled more and more fiercely, that prayer fell away. I could hear the door begin thudding in its own frame as something lurched against it. At this point, Laura must have heard it as well. She shot up in bed and looked over at me. "Greg, what the hell is that?" Something began crashing against the door. A chorus of strange voices began screaming from outside the house. Their harmony created an ethereal echo that filled every inch of our home. I glanced over to the window and saw several spider-like hands pressed against the glass. Their skin was the same twisted red hue that I'd seen the night before. Their gnarled fingertips had pressed so tightly against the glass that it had begun to crack under their grip. The same crackling noise had filled our entire home as every window in the house had simultaneously begun to experience the same fate. Laura's eyes fixated themselves on the gangly hands outside, Tears welled up in her eyes as her voice faltered and fell away into a low whimper. I didn't know what to do, so I reached over and pulled her tight against my chest. "Don't look at them," I whispered to her over and over again. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to myself. I heard the front door splinter open under the weight of something incredibly massive. A tremendous tundra of thudding and thumping had filled the lower floor. Soon to follow was the sounds of every window in the house shattering open one by one. I squinted my eyes open for just a moment to see the bedroom window crack and explode into shards of glass. Broken slivers had flown their way towards me and my wife. We both closed our eyes to shield ourselves. The hands from outside had begun to stretch their way into our home. They seemed to lurch their way in our direction, as if they could see us. I closed my eyes again and began praying. The thudding from downstairs had found its way into our kitchen. The sounds of cabinets clattered open and shut. The symphony of voices floated their way into the halls. I was left waiting for the feeling of those lanky hands to wrap over me. I was preparing myself to be dragged out of my home at any moment. To feel them pull me right through the broken glass-filled window and into the mouth of whatever those arms were connected to. But instead, I was greeted by silence. The banging had stopped. All of the noises had stopped. I could hear Laura crying in my arms, but that was it. I opened my eyes and saw nothing more than the shattered window of my bedroom greeting me. I quickly picked up a large piece of glass and wrapped it in one of my socks before getting up to my feet. Room by room, I cleared. Every window in our home was broken. Every single one. I got to our front door and saw its frame completely knocked off its hinges. Broken splinters of wood lay scattered across the hardwood floor. Yet the thing that got me the most was that the pie was gone. We stopped locking up our doors after that night. Now, we're always prepared to entertain any guests that might show up, no matter the time. I've never considered myself a nosy person. No more nosy than the next guy. I just have what my ma would call an unhealthy amount of curiosity. I was the kid who climbed to the top of the big oak in the backyard just to see what was in the crow's nest. I was the kid who dug a hole in the backyard so deep that I hit groundwater because I was convinced there was a cave under our house and I wanted to see it. To see. My folks aren't dirt poor, but they're pretty close. They're part of that missing middle of Britain. The people who work 40 hours a week until they die, with no savings to speak of. I got my first job at a horse stable when I was 14. It didn't last very long. I knew I needed to get a job because I knew we needed the money. So I bounced around for the next few years, washing dishes, waiting tables, until I graduated high school. Dad was really tough on me about university. He never went. No one in his family did. So there were a few fights about where I'd go after school. It was a huge shock to me when just after graduation, he drove me down to the uni. He'd been classmates with the dean, and they'd come up with an arrangement where I'd get a full scholarship, provided I made good grades and worked for the university. I never felt like a scholar. In high school, I kept my head down and did enough to get by, pulling off a few B's and a few C's. I wasn't interested in learning, because learning wasn't interesting. Uni was different. I took mainly core classes: mathematics, English, history, science, but they were fascinating. For one thing, no one cared if I showed up or not. It was entirely up to me to succeed, so I did. In exchange for my education, I worked security and did some light maintenance duties. Maintenance was a no-brainer. I've always been handy, and most of the fix-it jobs were the type that could be solved with a liberal application of WD-40 or elbow grease, or both. Security was a different story. Security gave me superpowers. The job itself was pretty easy. I got a uniform, a badge, a flashlight, and Mum gave me some keychain mace for my birthday. I worked mostly nights and weekends, and doubles during long holiday breaks. I was to walk around the full campus twice a night, checking the labs, computer centre and library. The rest of my time was pretty much my own. There were 2 other guards, Jake and Al, but they worked different shifts from me. We had overlap nights on Wednesday nights, where we get together for about an hour to discuss any major events or changes. There might have been some beer at those meetings, but I'm underage, and you can't prove anything. Jake worked mostly day shift, and Al worked swings and some overnights during the week. Jake was a younger guy, training to be on the local police force, so he took his job pretty seriously. On the other hand, I'm pretty sure Al mostly slept during his shifts. Al was 2 years older than dirt, so he deserved his rest. Remember that bit about superpowers? My first night on the job, Al gave me a huge keychain with about 1,000 keys on it. It weighed nearly 5 pounds and was secured to my belt with a heavy-duty metal chain. "Don't lose that keychain, kid," Al said. "You got the keys to the kingdom right there. Any door that don't open, you don't want to go in it." My work hobby, the thing that kept me awake on those long, cold winter break nights, was exploring. I made it a point, every night, to open a door that I'd never opened before. I started in the new section, where the library and computer centre were, opening each room, each closet, making a map in my head of where everything was. Some nights, I might have explored 2 or 3 rooms. Other nights, I might not have had time for anything more than an odd, out-of-the-way broom closet. The uni's actually a pretty large campus, for having a full student body of only 12 or 1,300. It was built in 1896 and became government-owned in the 30s. There were 3 main sections. The old school housed the administration offices and a few unlucky classrooms. Unlucky due to the lack of central heating and air. And the 3-story building had no elevators. The labs were a brutalist horror of poured concrete slabs and tiny windows. Built back in the 70s, when buildings that looked like Soviet radiators were in style. The new library was steadily losing its new, built in the late 90s boom, and made in that unique red brick and glass style, like everything else during those years. When I think back to those early days, those days before, I think how stupid I was, how naive. I should have thought about winter. I should have thought about the solstice. By December of my second year at uni, I'd cleared every room in the new library. I'd opened every door, checked every closet, and had a good mental map of the whole building. It was, ultimately, pretty unimpressive. I found no buried treasure, no secret stash of missing computer supplies cached in a forgotten closet. December's a slow time for the uni. After the mad rush of finals, the campus was suddenly deserted, the remaining few staff seemingly lost. The building stood silent and dark in the thin winter breezes. We had a steady series of snowstorms, but none bad enough to close the campus. I made sure the pavements were clear and the entryways salted, but otherwise tried to stay indoors. Besides, I had the old school to explore. The main old school building, Downing Hall, was a 4-story V-shaped building. It had no elevators, tiny stairwells, and was only exempted from health and safety rules due to its historical importance. It had no air conditioning, save for sporadic window mount units that were only permitted to be installed on the rear of the building, so as not to spoil the building's historic charm. The building's heat came from a massive, ancient boiler in the basement. As far as I knew, Al was the only person who knew anything about the boiler, and he must have kept it in good shape, because I never heard of any complaints about it. I spent the second week after finals poking through the top floors of Downing Hall. I didn't have a lot of time for exploring every night, as the snow gave me more than usual upkeep chores, but I made steady progress. I discovered a small room in the attic on the left wing that must have been an old dean's office, complete with a beautiful antique desk and wardrobe. I checked both, thinking I might find something historic to give to the dean, but the wardrobe was empty, save for a moth-eaten wool scarf. And the desk's contents were limited to a few old newspapers and some tax forms from the 50s. A level below, on the building's 4th floor, I found 24 small, empty classrooms. In my handyman mindset, I checked the windows for loose glass panes and for water or rodent damage. I fully expected to see some rat droppings, or at least some insect damage, but I found none. The 2nd and 3rd floors were much the same, except the rooms on the rear of the building were air-conditioned, and therefore actively used for classes when school was in session. The main floor was administration, and included the dean's office. I thought it wise not to snoop around in my boss's office, or in payroll, so I skipped a lot of these rooms. I made my way to the stairwell to the basement, used my superhero keychain, opened the heavy door, and went down. The basement of Downing Hall was different to that of the new library. For one thing, it was a lot more cramped. The hallway was narrow and the ceiling was low, with doorways leading off at regular intervals. I checked every room, flipping the old 2-button switches to on, using my flashlight on the dark corners. I carried a few packs of spare light bulbs in my satchel, thinking to replace any that had burned out and save the environment while I was at it. The little rooms mostly contained junk, spare desks, filing cabinets full of 40 and 50-year-old papers, old holiday decorations, and so forth, lit by naked hanging bulbs. I'm not an imaginative kind of guy. I guess I'm pretty smart. I'd made straight A's in my college courses. It had never occurred to me to be scared. I didn't think, I'm alone in a creepy old basement. This was my place, my job, my hobby, and it all seemed so normal. By the night of the 20th of December, I'd made my way to the boiler room. The furnace was a massive monstrosity of iron and rivets, pipes and gauges. It was hellishly hot in that room, and equally loud. It was, however, neat and very clean. Al kept it that way, because he said a clean boiler lets you get more shut-eye. The furnace had been converted from coal to gas at some point, but the soot had stained the walls of the room, and the old coal chute still opened in one of the corners. I had no intention of giving the boiler room more than a glance. I'd been there dozens of times, and there was nothing to see, just a workbench and the furnace itself, when I noticed a small door to the back and left behind the furnace. That's weird, I thought to myself. I'd never seen that door before. But then again, I'd never stood in that particular spot beside the workbench, and I'd never really looked. The door was smaller than a normal door, maybe 5 feet tall, painted in the same non-colour, drab grey-brown of the walls, and was made of metal, just like the other doors in the basement. I went over to it and touched the handle. I think the body knows, sometimes, when things are wrong. Have you ever had that feeling, like you're being watched? When you know that you're totally alone, and no one can see you, but you feel eyes on you. Have you ever gone left instead of right? Because you got a feeling that you just shouldn't go to the right today. It didn't work that way for me. When I touched that doorknob, nothing felt any different. My head didn't hurt, my neck hairs didn't stand up, and I didn't hear an inner voice saying, "Don't do it." The doorknob turned, but the door wouldn't open. I looked more closely and saw a small keyhole. I checked my magic keychain and found 3 possible matches. Struck out on the first 2, and the third worked, of course. Of course. The hinges squealed like they hadn't been used in a long time. I'm talking decades. My handyman instincts noted it. WD-40, I mumbled. I hauled open the door and stepped through, into another small, cramped hallway. The light switch worked, and the single bulb blew with a crack. Damn it! My hackles did raise then. I flicked on my flashlight and quickly swapped out the hallway bulb with a new one. I looked around and saw that this hallway was narrow, straight, and ended a few yards away at another door. That door opened easily onto another stairway. "What the hell?" I said. No one had ever mentioned a sub-basement for this building. The hairs on the back of my neck were still standing up. I shook it off as nerves from the blown bulb and walked to the stairwell. It was a standard stairwell and looked pretty much the same as the others in the building. I walked to the bottom and met another door. I pushed through it to see another long, narrow hallway, with doors leading off to either side at regular intervals. The first door to my left was unlocked and opened fairly easily onto a storage closet. There were stacks of late 60s era books, a few desks, and a decaying mop in its bucket. The door across from that was unlocked, but didn't open so easily. I hauled the door open to find a larger room that looked to have been used as a classroom. There were desks, a blackboard, anatomical diagrams, and posters on the walls. Everything was covered in an inch of dust. and appeared to have not been touched in a long time. Why would anyone put a classroom down here? I mumbled to myself. How would they even convince students to get down here in the first place? I remember thinking, at that point, that I must have somehow discovered a back way into the other wing of the V-shaped Downing Hall. Maybe this is where the old science classes were held, before the labs were built. I moved on to the next set of rooms. They were both classrooms, abandoned, dust-covered, and mostly empty. So were the next pair, and the next. I saw a total of 12 disused classrooms in that hallway, and a small break room, complete with a lonely coffee pot. I also found 2 small restrooms. I didn't spend much time checking them out, as the lights didn't work, and I didn't feel like replacing those bulbs. I found myself getting slightly nervous. I was in a strange section of the campus, and I was working alone that night. In the back of my mind, I just couldn't truly justify the existence, the waste, of a whole floor of unused classrooms. When I got to the end of the hallway, I met another steel door. I opened it and saw another stairwell. I was fully expecting this stairwell to go up, to connect to one of the other main stairwells in Downing Hall. To my surprise, the stairs only went down. This was the point, I remember, at which I began to get scared. No way. There's no way these stairs go down. How would anyone get down here? The stairwell echoed that last word back at me. I should have checked the time. I should have been concerned with finishing my rounds. I should have been hungry for lunch. I should have run. I started to climb down the stairs. This stairwell was unlit and appeared to be much older and in a much worse condition than the others. It was also longer, much longer. After a few minutes of walking down the steps, I began to count them. At every 12 steps, there was a small landing, a turn, and another set of steps. Down. After 10 landings, I reached another door. It was unlocked and opened easily. The hinges squeaked, and the echoes died like lost things in the dark. I groped against the left wall for a light switch, and there was none. I checked the right, and the wall was equally smooth. I cast the flashlight around, but saw nothing. Nothing forward, nothing to either side, and nothing above. I snapped my fingers, listening for the echo. I may or may not have heard one. I slowly came to realize that the room into which I'd entered was enormous, cavernous, possibly the biggest room I'd ever physically experienced. I shrank back to the doorway for a moment. This room can't be here, I said to myself. I started to think about going back, but I also started to think about wanting to know what was in there. I took a step forward, and another, until I was walking steadily into the room. I kept a steady pace, counting my steps. I looked over my shoulder every few yards, using the light from the open doorway to orient myself. I walked slowly for 100 yards, 200 yards, until I saw a dim glow ahead. The glow got faintly brighter and larger as I walked towards it. Another 100 yards, and another, and 3 more passed, until I could make out a small, dim light bulb near a door. That door was of a different type entirely. It was huge, 14 feet tall at least, and half again as wide. The surface was black metal, studded with rivets and bolts, mounted on huge hinges. Across the face of the door, engraved into the metal, were words in some strange looping script that I couldn't recognize. Every surface was carved with that script, or with strange diagrams made of splayed circle-ended lines. In the center of the door was a large spoked wheel lock, and in the center of that lock was a tiny keyhole. Above the keyhole was a sigil, enclosed in 3 circles. I looked behind me, and I couldn't see the light from the stairwell. I couldn't see anything at all. I held the superhero keychain to the dim light and flipped through the keys. Of course, there was one small, battered key that looked as though it might fit. I inserted it into the lock and turned it. I heard a click and a thud and a sound from within the door like pouring pebbles or dry teeth. I pulled the key from the lock and grasped the spokes of the wheel lock. My heart was racing and sweat was dribbling into my eyes. I turned the spokes to the left, counterclockwise. Widdershins, some buried memory in my head said, and kept turning until the wheels stopped. There was another thud and a crack, and then silence. The darkness behind me no longer felt empty. In fact, it felt positively crowded, as if I had an audience watching me. I stepped back from the door and flashed my light around. Still nothing. Dry, empty floor. I turned back to the door, grasped the large cast iron handles, and pulled. Nothing. I tried harder, putting all of my weight into the pull, and at the last moment, at the end of my strength, I heard another crack, and the door groaned open on a draft of cool, stinking air. The smell was heavy, moist and musky. I had a flash memory of my mother taking me to the zoo as a child, and the smell of the cat house with the lions. At the thought of the lions, I let go of the handles and stumbled back a bit. I carefully shone my light into the yawning black crevice of the open door. I saw a short hallway that opened into a small, cramped room. I saw a filthy, rusted metal chair. I saw bones. Small bones. I saw, or heard, or smelled a form so black it seemed to suck in the light of my flashlight. I saw a black form rushing towards me, running towards me, filling the hallway, howling and laughing and speaking in a voice that sounded like mountains collapsing. I remember fangs and words that turned my bones to rusted glass. I remember feathers and a hand with too many fingers, jeweled with something unspeakable, and the smell, the stink of something long caged. I remember wings. I don't know how long I wandered in the dark, alone under hundreds of feet of rock. There was no light. There was no way to judge time. My flashlight was dead, and my cell phone, and even the small specks of luminescent paint on my cheap wristwatch were dark. There was something wrong with my right leg. It hurt, but I couldn't see enough to find out why. I kept hearing my audience, there in that cavernous room. I screamed at them. I felt one of them touch my face, and I threw my flashlight at it. It bounced and rattled and became still, somewhere that I was not. Something laughed, later. I raved and screamed, but didn't throw anything else. I found the doorway, after hours, or was it days of crawling. There were no lights in the stairwell. After years of climbing, I crawled into that first forgotten hallway. I sliced my fingers on the crushed remains of the light bulbs that I'd packed in my satchel. I crawled down the hallway and reached the next stairwell. I hauled myself up them and finally out into the boiler room. When I staggered out of Downing Hall, 2 full days after going in, it was into dim winter daylight and a full police presence. 5 people had been found dead on or around the campus. All had been brutally, savagely murdered. Bodies splayed open, viscera missing. The teeth marks suggested a wild animal, but the murder scenes and body positioning also displayed a certain intelligence to them. There was also the writing, carved into the flesh when it was not yet dead meat. The police wouldn't talk about the writing. The police wouldn't talk to me either, not afterwards. When they first saw me stumble out into the daylight, covered in blood, they assumed I was the perpetrator. They quickly changed their assumptions when the medics pointed out the green stick fracture, the dehydration, the concussion, and the obvious shock. The police asked me a lot of questions, and I answered as best I could. I told them about the door in the boiler room. They couldn't find it. They showed me the bare, smooth wall from where I'd crawled, dazed and broken. My tracks stopped at that wall. 2 policemen tried breaking through the wall in that spot, only to meet old brick and older earth past that. They wanted to know where the long black feathers came from, stuck to my clothes by dried blood. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The police, the medics, no one would look at me anymore. The scars on my face, the deep, gouged out writing, was not a sight that most would want to see. I was marked. Whatever I'd let out, whatever had killed and eaten 5 people, and a week later 6 more, had marked me as a friend. The country of the Philippines has boasted a wealth of stunning natural wonders and a myriad of terrifying stories, from vaguely supernatural to downright spine-chilling. In the past, a street in Manila's biggest city, Quezon, has hosted such scary tales. A particular street, Balete Drive, was named after an endemic tree in the region and has been the subject of numerous paranormal reports and investigations. The Balete trees have been thought in many areas of the country to be dwelling places for supernatural beings, such as the Tikbalang, a half-human, half-horse humanoid. In some places, sorcery rituals are known to be performed inside the chambers formed by the tree. Also, among others, some superstitious folks suggest not bringing in Balete as decorative plants inside a house, as they allegedly invite ghosts. In the past, Balete Drive an undivided 2-lane street, and the main thoroughfare of New Manila was lined with large bolete trees that darkened the area considerably and made it appear frightening to some Manila residents. The following story was recounted to me by an old acquaintance of my father, a fellow cab driver who used to transport people to other parts of the metro. While going through the infamous Bolete Drive more times than he could remember. The man's now retired, and he visited my father on an invitation to his 65th birthday. The celebration went as well as anyone could have hoped for. Families and friends that have long been separated apart were reunited. Food and drink were aplenty, and the famous Filipino karaoke blasted through the air. It was 9:30 in the evening when the celebration started slowing down. One by one, guests bade my father farewell, with promises that they'd be there on his next birthday. One of the guests, the old cab driver, had to stay at our place, as it would be too difficult for him to go home that late. The man currently lives in a town in Laguna, a nearby province from Metro Manila, and 100 miles away from our residence in Quezon City. We asked him to stay the night at our home for his own safety and convenience. After a series of overly dramatic convincing from my father, the man relented and decided to stay. I promised him I'd drive him to the bus terminal to Laguna first thing in the morning. It was past 11 when all of the guests, except for some family members and the old man, had left. The celebration, however, did not entirely end, as my father, the old man, and I decided to sit and pour ourselves some more liquor. The two old-timers' conversation mostly circled around their time as fellow cab drivers, working for the same operator. As a 31-year-old working man, it was a pleasure to see both my father and his friend reminisce about their past. As inexperienced as I was at that point in my life, I did little to contribute to the conversation. For the most part, I was there as a listener, a passenger on the two old men's trip down memory lane. The conversation and drinking between all three of us lasted until past midnight. I was about to announce to my old drinking buddies that it was time to call it a night, when suddenly, the old man told me to wait, as he'd like to tell a story he just remembered while reminiscing about his past. My father sat straight up, seemingly taken out of his drunken stupor upon hearing his friend's words. "What? You're going to tell us that story again?" my father, in his drunken state, asked. "Yeah, I know I've told you this many times before, but your son hasn't heard it yet. Besides, what better way to end the night than with a good old scary story, eh?" the man added, accompanied by a chuckle. "All right, well, just so you know, my son here is easily spooked. He also drives through that same road," my father jested, aiming to take a jab at my reluctance to listen to scary stories, especially ones about the infamous street that I knew my father was referring to. "Nah, look at your son. He's a grown-up. I'm sure he can take a few scary stories before bedtime. Can you, son?" the old man uttered as his face turned towards me. I nodded in confidence. I didn't know what to expect at that point, but I could tell then and there that it would be an interesting story. The old man fixed himself up, trying to shake off some of the alcohol in his system from a long night of drinking. "All right then, here's my story. A true life experience when I was still young, in the mid-70s, and I was in my mid-30s if I remember correctly, still driving a cab with your father. his face once again turned in my direction. This was when I encountered something I thought only existed in horror movies or novels. An encounter which, at that time, I seriously thought would be the end of me. He said this with a more somber tone. The old man's name was Rico, and this was his story. It was close to midnight when Rico, driving a cab assigned to him, found himself driving along the desolate stretch of Belette Drive. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows from the towering Belette trees that lined the road. He hated taking this route due to its infamy, not only due to alleged hunting, but mainly due to the street's poor lighting, mostly obscured by the tall Belette trees. The area was known to be accident-prone, and tragedies involving all sorts of motorists are reported almost monthly. His last passenger had insisted it was the quickest way to her destination. A young lady, dressed in a bright red gown, trying to get to a college prom held at a convention centre within the nearby University of the Philippines campus. Rico dropped his passenger off at the main gate and contemplated going back the same way he came, as doing so would allow for the shortest time to exit Belette Drive. Then he remembered the time. It was 10:15, and he was supposed to be at home by 11. While his working hours typically lasted until the wee hours, he wanted to get home early and get to bed for the rest of the night. He needed to wake up early the following morning, as he had to drive someone to an international airport. This basically means that going back to the portion of the street where he entered would require him to take a longer route back home. The alternative was to take the rest of Belette Drive, exiting at a main highway leading up to his residence in Caloocan. While very unappealing, this option would cut his travel time by about half an hour. After much contemplation, Rico decided to continue traversing Belette Drive. If I just focus my attention on the road and don't think of the stories, I should be able to exit the street in no time, he said to himself, trying to suppress his apprehension. Besides, those are just stories. Urban legends shared among friends on a drinking binge, he added. And so, Rico went on to take the remaining distance out of Belette Drive. The night was dark, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the road. The only sound was the engine's hum and the occasional rustle of leaves. He glanced at the clock. It was late, and he was still far from home. He turned up the radio, hoping some music would ease his tension, but the signal was weak. Only static filled the air. Rico focused on the road ahead. Just a few more kilometers, he thought. However, the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. Each turn brought unexpected bumps and shadows. He tried to keep his mind on the driving, but strange shapes flickered at the edge of his vision. Just my imagination, he muttered to himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something watched him. Every so often, he'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees. A stray dog, a cat, perhaps some college students that were up to no good. Rico shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. As he turned onto a curve suddenly, his headlights caught something. On the side of the road stood a figure. A woman in a white dress, her hair long and tangled. She looked lost and afraid, and Rico's heart raced. Should I help her? He thought. But the road was dark, and his instincts told him to keep driving. Rico hesitated, but eventually slowed down. A potential passenger this late at night was rare, and fares had been scarce all day. "Where to, ma'am?" Rico asked, rolling down the window slightly. The woman didn't respond. She simply opened the back door and slid into the seat behind him. Her movements were slow, and Rico couldn't help but notice how cold the air suddenly felt. "Balintawak," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rico nodded and began driving, trying to ignore the strange chill creeping up his spine. The road was eerily quiet, save for the hum of his engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a clearer look at his passenger. "Where exactly in Balintawak would you like me to take you, miss?" he asked, but she only stared ahead. The road twisted and turned beneath him, and the night seemed to grow darker. His mind raced. Was this a good decision? Should he have driven away? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something alarming in the mirror. Behind them, the shadows seemed to grow larger and darker, and an unshakable feeling of dread washed over him. He pressed the gas pedal, desperate to escape the growing fear. Rico's heart was now racing. A million thoughts ran through his mind. The lady in white still hadn't spoken a word since providing her destination. At this point, he decided to look in the rearview mirror to check on her once again. But what he saw froze him to the core. The woman's face was a blank void. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty, pale surface where her features should have been. Panic gripped him. He tried to focus on the road, but the rearview mirror seemed to pull his gaze back. The woman's head was now tilted slightly, as if she was staring directly at him, though she had no eyes to do so. He slammed on the brakes. "Ma'am, please, you need to get out," he shouted, his voice trembling. The woman didn't move. Instead, she leaned forward, and he felt her cold breath against his ear. "Why are you afraid?" she whispered. "You picked me up, didn't you?" The woman's words were accompanied by a chilling mist that penetrated through Rico's body. This was his breaking point. He stopped the cab right in the middle of the road and turned to the woman in the back seat, wanting to tell her to get out of the vehicle right away. But as he turns, the woman vanishes from the car, nowhere to be found. He was at a loss for words. Was he just imagining things? Was there really a woman a few minutes ago inside the vehicle? Am I finally losing it? Was Rico's final thought. With the woman no longer inside the vehicle, Rico started the vehicle's engine again and continued to drive down the empty road. His knuckles turned white while he tightly gripped the steering wheel. He glanced at the dashboard, and he saw he was clocking in at more than 100 kilometers per hour. Twice the speed limit. He couldn't care less at this point. His only thought was to get out of the accursed Balete drive as soon as possible. Then, after a few minutes of driving at a dangerous speed, he realized something. Where the hell's the exit? He thought. This road seems to never end. I've driven through this same road during the day, and I don't remember this road being this long. He was muttering to himself in a desperate attempt to make sense of what was happening. He glanced at the clock. Time was passing, yet he hadn't reached the exit. Almost an hour had passed, and he was still driving along Belette Drive. This can't be real, he once again muttered to himself. I'll run out of gas soon. There's no way I'm stopping on this road. I'll stay inside the car and spend the rest of the night if I have to. After more than an hour had passed, he saw what appeared to be light in the distance. A small light flickering through his windshield. Hope surged through him. He sped towards it, hoping he was finally nearing the exit. But as he got closer, the light vanished, leaving only darkness behind. Rico looked around. The trees now seemed to close in on him, and he felt trapped. Please, what the hell's going on? He asked to no one, his voice trembling. He was growing desperate and more terrified at that point. Terrified that he may never be able to reach the exit. Am I dead? Did that woman actually kill me? And now I'm just another ghost driving along this forsaken road on an endless journey to escape. Is this the afterlife? Am I in limbo? A series of thoughts flooded his mind, with each one drawing him closer to a somber but likely conclusion. In Rico's mind, he might as well no longer be in the world of the living, as there was no making sense of the events that had just unfolded. Another half an hour passed, and he was getting tired of the endless driving. He was so tired that he even considered stopping in the middle of the road and accepting his fate. No, I'm not going down without a fight. I still have my hunting knife tucked in under my seat. This was Rico's last flicker of resolve. While trying to find the hunting knife that was gifted to him by a friend in the army. Previously, it had given him the confidence to fight off any potential robbers during his night shift. That same knife was giving him hope to, at the very least, have something to fight whatever malevolent entity had been causing him such torment. A few more minutes had passed, when suddenly, his headlights caught something. He hit the brakes. Now, standing in the middle of the road, was the same woman in a white dress, her hair long and tangled. Rico screamed out loud as he hit the gas and tried to drive around her. Just as he was about to pass, she instantly vanished into thin air. Rico, however, didn't stop driving. He wasn't picking up the same scary lady this time. He continued to drive. The road was now getting even narrower, with a steep drop on one side. He pressed on, his knuckles whiter than ever. The figure appeared again at several more turns, always maintaining the same distance. His hands trembled as he struggled to maintain control of the car. The road was becoming increasingly treacherous, with potholes and loose gravel making driving a challenge. His heart pounded in his chest, and beads of sweat trickled down his temples. He didn't remember the road being this rough, but this didn't matter much to him. In his mind, he might as well have veered off course, ending up in a remote, secluded road that may very well lead to his eventual demise. Rico, however, kept driving. Not a moment had passed when he suddenly felt an all too familiar sensation. The sensation that someone was with him in the vehicle. The atmosphere inside almost instantly turned chilly, accompanied by a subtle but audible breathing in the back seat. "You're here again, aren't you?" Rico remarked. with a now surprisingly braver tone. The events leading up to that point had exhausted him of all of his fears. He somewhat became desensitized to the woman's presence, and he'd long come to an understanding that if this was going to be his end, then so be it. But he intended to fight back, whether it be using his knife or any other means that would at least give him comfort that he went down like a man, fighting. I just want to go to my family, came a chilling voice from the back. Will you take me there, mister? Where? To Balintawak, Rico calmly responded, trying to sound as casual as possible. Yes, Balintawak. All right, I can take you there. But you see, you have to pay a fare for me to take you there, you know, he added, while now trying to display his usual self as a taxi driver. There was no response from the woman in the back, however. You see here, this is what we call a taximeter, he continued speaking, while tapping on the taximeter. Still, there was no response from the passenger. This thing here clocks in the distance we've travelled and calculates how much it'll cost, he went on, without paying any mind to his passenger's silence. From my estimate, the total fare from here to Balintawak should cost you around 500 peso. Rico's sentence was cut short by a new development. The woman, who'd been silent the whole time he was talking, all of a sudden grabbed his right hand with a grip so tight that it almost restricted blood flow to the rest of his arm. The woman's unexpected move caused panic in him, shattering his initial facade of calmness and fearlessness. The man frantically tried to shake his right hand to remove the woman's vice-like grip, to no avail. The woman's hand felt ice cold. So cold, it delivered a level of pain to his entire body that he never knew he would get to feel. "Get off of me, you wretch," Rico commanded, while trying to steer the vehicle from going off of the road. The woman, however, did not relent, and finally blared something in Rico's ear. "Take me to Balintawak." The words were so loud that Rico could feel his eardrums shattering as the vehicle's glass windows and windshield vibrated, about to break at any second. He instinctively reached out for the hunting knife, tucked safely underneath the driver's seat with his left hand, momentarily letting go of the steering wheel. He effortlessly unsheathed the knife from its scabbard and, with all of his might, stabbed the woman's hand that was holding his right arm. The knife, however, failed to even penetrate her skin. It would seemingly bounce off of her arm with every stab that he attempted. Rico, seeing that his attacks didn't work on her arm, attempted to stab his attacker in the face. The car, at this point, had been swerving from left to right, with Rico's remaining free hand alternating between attacking the woman and manning the steering wheel. With the remaining strength he could muster, he took one full swing with the knife at her face. The almost 90-degree left hook landed on its intended target. While he couldn't exactly tell where the tip of the knife landed, he surmised that it was somewhere on the lower left eye of the woman. To his horror, though, even this long-winded attack did no damage to the woman in the back. She didn't budge and continued her vice-like grip on his right arm while wailing the same words as before. At this moment, he realised that the woman isn't simply a ghost. She's a malevolent entity feeding on his fear, slowly draining his life force with every second her cold, bony hand clutches into his. Left with no other choice, he turns to other means he knew could potentially ward off ghosts and evil spirits. Prayer. Up until that point, he'd never considered himself a religious person. Although born and raised as a Roman Catholic, he rarely attended church or mass. However, he spent all 4 of his high school years at a Catholic school. During those years, he learned to memorize common prayers and other religious incantations that surprisingly stayed with him even now. Not being able to make the sign of the cross using his right hand, he did so with his left. This time, he decided to fight the entity not with physical force, but with his will. Anything to repel the malevolent spirit. The struggle became a terrifying battle of wills, a fight for his sanity and his life, as the eyeless woman in white relentlessly tried to pull him into the darkness. The woman, however, is undeterred, and the car becomes a battleground between the driver's unyielding strength and a demon eager to claim its next victim. In a race against time, he doubles down on reciting prayers from his childhood, testing his courage as the woman now seemingly tries to take control of the taxi, steering it towards a ditch in the side of the road. Desperate and determined, he tries to invoke ancient verses that resonate with divine strength. The woman, who now resembles more of a demonic entity, roars in fury, but his unwavering strength begins to weaken its hold. With a final, resounding chant, Rico confronts the demon head-on, channeling all of his hope and courage into one last attempt. And when the tussle between Rico and the now demon-looking woman seemed to never end, a saving grace unexpectedly came. A beam of light from a semi's headlight illuminated the vehicle. This instant illumination momentarily distracted him from his ordeal. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A truck driven by a live human being. At this point, he didn't even notice that his taxi had ceased to move. He'd somehow managed to hit the brakes amidst the chaos and halted the vehicle to a full stop on his side of the road. Then, in only a matter of a few seconds, his awareness returned to the tribulation at hand. The demon was gone. She'd somehow disappeared when the lights hit the vehicle. Not wanting to let his guard down, and not fully believing his torment was finally over, Rico spun around the vehicle, trying to find any trace of the woman in a white dress. Finally, after what felt like hours of thoroughly checking the vehicle and the surroundings, he leaned back in the driver's seat and exhaled a deep sigh of relief. His heart was still pounding at an exhilarating speed, and the pain in his right arm from the woman's grip still persisted. But he knew that this time he was saved. He took another few minutes to catch his breath before starting the ignition, and with visibly shaking hands, grabbed the steering wheel and continued to drive along Balete Drive. Not long after, a green metal sign perched atop a metal pole had a sign that read, "You're now exiting Balete Drive." He almost broke into tears upon reading the sign. "I made it! I survived!" he exhaled to himself with clenched fists, pounding the steering wheel for a triumphant victory. Rico made it home at 2 a.m. Needless to say, he didn't get any sleep and ended up picking up his passenger an hour earlier than agreed. The ordeal left a deep mark on Rico's life. He actively avoids Balete Drive during his shift, and if the situation really needs him to, he makes sure to drive along the road during the day. Nowadays, Rico enjoys the retired life with his family in Laguna. Well, what can you say, kid? Wasn't that a great scary story I just told? Rico went on to ask, while gently slapping my left arm. Yeah, it was a cool story. I'm glad you made it out alive, I responded with an audible chuckle, signalling that while I enjoyed it, I was unsure of how true it was. Rico caught on to my sarcasm and showed me his right arm. Tell me, son, what do you see? He asked. I looked at him, unsure of what he wanted me to see, but I squinted at his right arm. The old man's skin has turned dull and wrinkled due to his old age, but upon careful inspection, I swear I could see a print, a handprint that, although subtle, had a clear outline of human fingers attached to a palm. Is that what I think it is? Was all I could say. Yes, kid, it's exactly what you think it is, he responded. I could only look at the old man with apparent disbelief at that point. Are we done? Our conversation was interrupted by my father, who'd just woken up from a nap. Unbeknownst to us, my old man fell asleep shortly after Rico started recounting his experience. My father had already heard the same story from his friend more times than he could count, and he surely wouldn't mind not hearing it another time. Yeah, I think we're done here. I'm already way past my bedtime as it is, he jested with an audible laugh. The two old men went to bed at around 1 a.m. He'd recounted that story for almost an hour. I stayed awake for a few minutes in order to clean the table where we'd had our little soiree. The next morning, I made good on my promise and drove Rico to the bus station. In tow was my father riding next to me. After telling his scary story, Rico and I had somewhat developed a bond, and he requested to be seated in the passenger seat next to me. Along the way, the old man and my father continued their conversation, reminiscing about the past. He occasionally spills out silly secrets from my father's past life, all in good fun. After 45 minutes of driving, we arrived at the bus station. We finally bade Rico goodbye, and my father and I drove back home shortly after. Every now and then, I remember Rico's story about his encounter with the woman in white and the long, empty, unending road. I'd contemplate whether to believe the old man's story was true each time. While his story may be just one of the many fabricated tales and creepy stories about Balete Drive, I could also tell that he wasn't lying when he recounted his experience. While ultimately, I can't say I believe his story, on the other hand, I do think that the old man fully believes that his encounter was real. I'd always be reminded of the old man's story every time I happen to drive by the same road. I may not admit it, but as a precaution, I always avoid driving through the road late at night, lest I encounter the woman in white of Balete Drive. This may be a violation of military protocol and a breach of national security, but I don't care. I don't think my superiors care either. None of us know what to make of what we found lurking in those dark waters. And none of us want to be the ones to decide what to do, for fear of making the situation worse. All I can do is outline what happened, and hope that someone who understands what the hell is going on hears this, and can do something about it. The Aberdeen Proving Grounds is a facility located in Aberdeen, Maryland. Its primary function is as a testing ground for military equipment, primarily explosive ordnance, but it used to handle chemical weapons as well. The facility has a wide variety of test ranges, allowing for testing and training on a wide variety of explosives. This testing has made me question what we know about reality. I was first made aware of the super pond when I took my current position at the base. It's an 860 million gallon pool that's roughly circular, 1,000 feet across, and 150 feet deep at the deepest point. It's connected to the Chesapeake Bay by a man-made canal. Its primary purpose is to allow for testing and training with underwater explosives. As such, boats are often brought into the pond and sunk during the tests, and underwater structures are sometimes constructed. Therefore, it's necessary to perform regular maintenance on the pool. This usually means dredging out debris, but also entails making sure the pond remains structurally sound. To do so, we often send divers into the pond to make sure everything's all right. Well, after reviewing reports detailing what's been going on over the course of the last few months, I can assure you, everything is not all right down there. Roughly 3 months ago, we performed a test involving a new kind of explosive. I'm still not entirely sure about all the particulars, because a lot of the details are classified beyond my clearance level. But from what I've been able to tell, this was supposed to be cutting-edge stuff. Something about high-energy reactants generating some kind of high-order quantum reactions that result in something else or another. One of the researchers I tracked down tried to explain it to me in layman's terms, and as I understand it, the explosive was supposed to create a bubble of a type of matter that's some kind of a cross between a gas and a magnetic field, which is then ignited into a hot plasma by a wave sent through it. The upshot was that this stuff was supposed to basically create explosions inside the target, blowing it apart from the inside out. The test was conducted on a platform on the water, out in the super pond. This was apparently because the reaction wouldn't travel through water, so they could better get an idea of how effective it was on a target without any collateral damage messing up the results. The official report I read stated the test was conducted, but the rest of the report is missing the usual details, even for a non-classified report. However, now that the base staff is all comparing notes, I've talked to someone who observed the test, and I understand why they didn't include the details in the report. They'd have been fast-tracked for a discharge. The test firing occurred early in the morning, just before dawn. They'd floated a metal barge with the test device in the centre of the pond, with several sensors arrayed on the barge and shoreline. When they flicked the switch, the observer said there was a delay before the explosion. But in the delay, he swears he saw an air ripple travel inward towards the device, before a bright flash and a loud boom. Waves kicked up and the barge was tossed about. However, when they could see the barge again, it appeared to be totally intact, without so much as a scorch mark on its surface, while the explosive device was no longer visible. While this was deeply unusual, it wasn't till they pulled the barge into the canal dock that they saw how weird it was. Apparently, when they pulled the barge out of the water, they discovered the bottom of the barge had a huge crater in it. It resembled an exit wound from a gunshot, but there was no hole on the other side of the plate, not even a pinhole one. The explosion apparently occurred under the device, just under the surface of the metal barge, and travelling downwards into the water. The test sensors showed the flash of light had unusual qualities, something about contradictory wavelengths and impossible colour band gaps. Testing of the barge and the air around the site showed no signs of radiation or particulates, but it did register an unusual pressure wave in the instance between the trigger and the actual explosion. The scientists marked the test as a failure, but said the data would be enough to keep them busy for a while. For the next couple of weeks, the pond sat empty. That isn't to say, however, that nothing happened there. Base security reported hearing weird noises in the vicinity of the pond, usually low booms. When I pressed a couple of them about it this week, they added there were other things that they'd heard but didn't include in their reports. These were divided into two categories. The first group was described to me by one guard as the sound of rushing wind, but backwards and inside out. I'm not sure what the hell that means, but the other guards I talked to said that was a good description. The second group was odd flashes in the pond. Most of the guards had chalked this up to tricks of the light or their eyes, since they were usually very brief and had an odd quality to them. Again, when I pressed the matter, all I got was some gibberish. This time about the lights being at the wrong depth of vision and angle for them to be appearing where they were seeing them. Move forward to 2 months ago, when we had a training exercise involving some underwater demolitions practice in the pond. I won't elaborate on who, what, or how many, since it's not relevant to the story. And while I may be disclosing top secret information, I'm not giving out any more than I feel is necessary. What I will say is the people involved in the operation were people that I'd consider very level-headed, calm individuals, whose job description involves remaining cool under pressure and relaying accurate information about their surroundings. So please bear that in mind when I tell you the next part of the story. We dropped an underwater structure designed to be a mock-up of something else into the centre of the pond, and their training was to make the dive, ascertain how the target settled, and demolish it with the least amount of surface disturbance. This meant that they'd have no data about conditions at the bottom of the pond. To further enhance this, we'd postponed a couple of maintenance dives till after the operation, in order to ensure there was no data about the actual conditions down there. The trainees were to dive into the canal and make their way into the pond and the target site with no surface contact till after the operation had been completed. That particular exercise went off without a hitch, but the reports filled by the team detailing their dive were deeply troubling. It started with a section about the unusual currents the team had encountered upon entering the lagoon. Cross currents, eddies and the like. Not the conditions you'd expect in a man-made pond, with only one connection to tidal water. A couple also noted unusual temperature variations over the course of a couple of yards. But most disturbing was the report from the team leader, who'd included a bit on the excellent job we'd done in giving them an unexpected situation to work through. The addition of coral reefs to the bottom of the pool had forced them to circumnavigate their way to the target, and was the type of thing that could catch a team off guard in the field. He did note, however, that whatever we'd painted them with killed the effectiveness somewhat, because it glowed faintly in a variety of colours, making it easier to avoid them in the dark water. This was startling, because we put nothing down there like that at all. Moreover, this was a man-made body of water, and was far too cold for coral to grow. After reviewing these reports, the maintenance team decided to send a diver down to see what the hell was going on down there. Armed with an underwater camera and full dive gear, he descended into the centre of the pond just after noon. Around 12:45, there was a long, low booming sound, and waves formed on the surface of the pond. The diver became unresponsive to tugs on his safety tether, and the decision was made to pull him up. At 12:52, he was hauled from the water, and it soon became clear he was dead. His underwater camera was missing, and he looked like he'd been struck by a truck. His body was a rag doll, and the autopsy showed that almost every bone in his body was broken. Not just broken, but splintered. It was ruled he'd accidentally stumbled across an unexploded ordnance and had been killed by the resulting concussion wave. Underwater, explosions are even more dangerous than on the surface. 3 weeks after the diver was killed, after additional safety training that follows a tragic accident, we sent down 2 more divers to perform some delayed maintenance, in addition to trying to find what the training exercise had seen. This time, they were outfitted with breathing hoses rather than dive gear, and were tethered to each other for additional security. Everything was going smoothly until 2:15 p.m, when I observed unusual lights under the surface, in what I judged to be in the vicinity of our divers. What I noticed most about the lights was the quality of them. They seemed to be very dim and pulsing, but the light didn't seem to be refracted by the water. It was like I was looking across a very wide, empty field at a candle flame. The lights seemed to move slowly, and it was impossible to tell how many of them there were. They simply moved closer together, encircling something. I realised what this meant far too late. All at once, the lights went out, and there was a thunderous boom, and a plume of water shot upwards from the pond, over where the lights had been. I'd been too mesmerised by what I was seeing, and I'll never, ever forgive myself for failing my 2 fellow servicemen that day. When we pulled them up, miraculously, one of them was still alive, despite massive blunt force trauma wounds. As we rushed him to shore, he strained to speak, but all that came out were broken whispers about living lights and growing down there. By the time they managed to get him to the hospital, he'd succumbed to his injuries. After this, the brass at the base went into full damage control. No one was allowed in the pond until the situation had been evaluated. Of course, how they planned to do this without going down there was anyone's guess. As the safety reviews and record searches were undertaken, I came to a decision. I'd made a terrible mistake that had cost the lives of 2 men, and somehow I had to atone. A review of the previous month's accident confirmed my suspicions. The incidents occurred in roughly the same area. So, I decided to take a blind, guilty shot. A late night dive, with only one single light, would prove to me that my decision had been the correct one. I was on the floor of the lagoon for less than 30 seconds before I found what I'd been looking for. As I recovered the item, I noticed a faint glow starting to grow behind me. And once I secured it, I didn't even spare a backwards glance before I dropped my way belt and rocketed to the surface. The next day, I took the crushed camera that I'd recovered from the bottom of the dark depths to the IT department. I convinced them it was my own personal underwater camera that I'd stupidly backed over with my car, and that I'd owe them big time if they could extract the vacation footage that was in it for me. They happily obliged, and I was in the room when the guy managed to get the memory connected to a spare PC. What we saw when we viewed the footage isn't something I'm ever going to be able to forget. The footage starts off with the surface check of the camera, before cutting out and coming back when the diver had gotten down far enough to warrant turning it on. The next 10 minutes after this document the coral reefs that had been previously reported. These were unlike any growth that had ever been seen in Earth's waters ever before. Of that, I'm sure. They grew in tall pillars, with crystalline, jagged edges. As the diver's light played over them, they reflected a rainbow of colours, but predominantly yellow, orange and pink. They seemed to be spaced evenly, roughly 10 feet apart from base to base, in a grid pattern. These towers ranged from 5 to 15 feet tall, with the taller ones showing signs of outcropping and mushrooming at the top. After 10 minutes, the diver cuts his lights for a moment, and it becomes clear there's an ambient glow in the area. Most of it is a soft yellow, orange and pink glow coming from the towers. But there are other colours occasionally interspersed for an instant, like a light being swept across the area. The camera's then moved sharply until it comes to rest on what looks like a light floating in the water. Well, light isn't the right word. It looks more like a lens flare that's hanging in the water. I'm not sure if this is what it actually looks like, or if something about the digital medium of the camera prevents it from recording what's in the centre of that halo, because the pixels at the centre of the concentric circles appear as the garbled error pixels that you sometimes see when a video is missing a keyframe. However, once the camera shifts enough or the light moves, it's impossible to tell which from the camera angle. The pixels snap back to normal. The camera follows this light for a minute, and then it moves again, revealing more of the lights, floating around the cameraman, with more approaching. They float around him, bobbing up and down, slowly circling. Some of the lights move away from him quickly, but others move in slowly to replace them. You're inextricably drawn to the conclusion that there's some kind of intelligence guiding them, like a school of fish, not used to humans, and therefore more curious than afraid of the unusual creature they see before them. And then we see the cameraman's hand reach out to touch one. All of a sudden, there's a bright flash, and the footage ends. A frame-by-frame analysis of the footage seems to show the light halos begin to contract as the hand makes contact with them. Then, as it contacts the errored pixels at the centre, there's a roiling of water, and a bright flash expands out from the centre. The last time displayed by the camera is 12:45, the time the boom was heard. This is the footage that was presented to base commanding officers last week, and it's where we stand now. No one knows what the hell to do. Some people want to drain the pond. Others are against it, saying we don't know what's going on down there. They point to some analysis of that failed test 3 months ago and say the footage from the camera somehow indicates that these things are related to that. They maintain that the water in the pond might be the only thing keeping them stable, and that removing the water might cause catastrophic results. Others are saying that the water is keeping them contained, and that if we remove it, they might get free. While others say if we let it remain, they might escape out into the waters of the bay, and then who knows what might happen. Some want to escalate this up the chain of command, while others think that would only make things worse. So, nothing's happening. Well, nothing's happening above the water, I should say. You see, I've been part of the group assigned to monitor the lagoon, mainly during the night shifts. I've noticed that as of 2 days ago, there's now a soft yellow, orange and pink glow coming from below the surface on the far side of the lagoon, like something slowly coming towards the surface. What's worse though, is it's slowly spreading out. I estimate it's only a couple of days now until it reaches the canal doors. Every day, my view becomes a little more fatalistic. Honestly, we don't know what the hell we're dealing with here. And I'm starting to think that everyone here's too frightened to be the one to make the final choice. Maybe the growth will stop at the doors. Maybe the light things can't really exist outside of the water. Maybe it'll all stay below the waterline. I think our only hope is that inaction is the right choice. Because I'm starting to think that when it comes to looking into the face of the unknown, the action we humans prefer is to cover our eyes. I need your help. People's lives are at stake. Possibly mine, I don't know yet. I live out in the country, basically in the middle of nowhere. I tend to a small farm, nothing much, but enough to live comfortably off of. I rely wholly upon my car to get to the city for groceries, and to go to farmers' markets and meet wholesalers who'd want to buy a portion of my crop. That is, until it vanished. One day, I woke up, got dressed, prepared to go into town to set up at the farmers' market, and I found that my car was missing. I didn't know if it had been stolen or if it just disappeared, but I went to go call the police. That's when I found out the phone lines don't work either. I've tried to call the police, call my family. Hell, I think I called for a pizza one time. But every time I do, I hear noises on the other end instead of whoever I should be talking to. Or at least their voicemail. Not screams or Latin chants, like I'm sure you expect from one of these stories, but peaceful noises. Birds chirping, running water, stuff like that. One time, I heard a woman's voice say something in what I think was Italian. She sounded happy, not excited, but at peace. I tried to look up what she said on the internet, but I can't transcribe a language I don't know. Speaking of the internet, I suppose you're wondering why I haven't contacted someone that way. Maybe tried to tell one of my clients of my situation, in hopes they'd bring a car or something that I could use to get out of here. Every time I go to email someone I know, I get some rubbish response that I'm very, very sure isn't being sent directly by them. For example, I sent this message to a friend of mine, Dave, in the hopes he could help me out. Yo, Dave, someone stole my car. Can you give me a lift to the police station? TY in advance. Jerry. This was the response I got. Brother Jeremiah, be at peace. God is with you now. You do not need to leave your little Garden of Eden, or rather, Farm of Eden. I would visit you, but the walls are too thick right now. They'll wear down eventually. All things do. Ezekiel. I don't know anyone called Ezekiel. I never get any responses that are signed by the people that supposedly sent them to me. I've gotten emails from lots of other people though. People with old names that make me think of Amish farmers or pilgrims navigating the Oregon Trail. Ezekiel, Hezekiah, Jonah, Deborah, Eunice. The list goes on. I don't think I've ever heard any of these names applied to anyone I've ever known, or even people I've heard of in the last century. They sound Amish. Maybe a bunch of Amish people are just messing with me or something. They're all nice, but very insistent on one thing. That I can't, or as they put it, don't need to, leave. Well, they're all nice, but with one exception. Whenever I try to message one person in particular, one of my clients, Mr. Drake, I get messages from someone calling themselves Isaac, where all of the other people I get messages from are relatively kind and peaceful. Isaac is cruel. Here's an example. Mr. Drake, I'm sorry I couldn't come to our arranged meeting. I'm currently stranded without a car. Would you mind coming to pick me up so I can report the theft of my car to the police? Thanks. Jerry Franklin. This is what I got back. Foolish heathen, thinkst thou that thou art too good for the gift thou hast received? Thou hast been blessed, and thou art as blessed as thou art ungrateful. Thou wilt burn in the fires of Satan, surely, for refusing to let God into thine black heart. Isaac. I don't understand who any of these people are, or what they want from me. Although with Isaac, it's probably a minute to tell me the good news, or why they're messaging me. I don't know why Isaac is the only one using Old English. If this was all that was happening, I'd think it was a bizarre prank by a deranged cult. I know it isn't though, because at the same time as these occurrences started happening, he showed up. The person, or perhaps thing I'm referring to, is an entity that I've dubbed the Faceless Mourner. It, or he, is the thing I need help with. He's the reason that there are lives in danger. He's about 5 feet and 10 inches tall. He's always wearing the same thing when I see him, a black suit and tie. Something that looks like it would be worn at a funeral. White silk gloves, and a ski mask with no holes in it. At least, I think it's a ski mask. He might not be wearing gloves either. He's either wearing a ski mask and gloves, or his skin is made of cloth. Either way, I'm confident he doesn't have a face. Every time I'm close enough to see him clearly, I can see he has no facial features beneath his mask. You know how you see the sloping slants of a person's visage under their mask? This guy, I swear, has almost rounded facial features. He has a pointed chin, a high brow, and that's it. I can't identify any eyes, mouth, or nose-like bumps under his cloth exterior. It's odd. I can't tell whether his face is a flat surface or almost rounded. He also carries an opened pink umbrella every time I see him. It's reddish pink with a white floral design. The handle is plain and wooden. It's either open or closed, depending on the weather. But he'll have it open on either days where it's raining, snowing, or in excess sunshine. He never shows any discomfort about the weather, despite how harsh the conditions here have become. He doesn't normally move, but when he does, he either does it in quick and short increments, or slowly and gradually, like a flower turning towards the sun. One last thing. Every time he appears, he brings a corpse with him. Now you see why I said lives are in danger. I'm not sure whether it's him killing them. I'm not even sure how they get here, as I never see them appear during my stakeouts. And he can't be carrying them, as his frame is quite diminutive. They appear differently, depending on what season it is. That's right, I said season. This has been happening for what I can only seem to measure in years. The first time the faceless mourner came, I noticed a small calendar on my nightstand. A little thing you'd see on someone's desk, rather than their wall. Nothing was remarkable about it, other than the fact a week's worth of days had passed since I fell asleep. Time passes faster here. Seasons change in the span of weeks. 1 year here lasts 52 days. Anyway, back to the corpses. I always find him standing over them, as if silently contemplating the loss of a friend. The conditions are the same every time, and they change depending on the season. For convenience, I'll describe these events as burials. The seasons won't change correctly, and the day won't end until either I bury the corpse or burn it. I've taken to burning them, as this has been happening so long, I'm running out of space in my yard. Although I've noticed the makeshift grave markers I prepared for them disappearing, and the ground levelling after a while. In winter, the burial takes place in a blizzard. The faceless mourner stands stock still against the raging winds and tearing snow. His umbrella seems to shield him adequately, as I've never seen him get wet in either a spring or winter burial. The corpse is always frozen solid under a foot of snow. This is probably the hardest burial for me, as I not only have to dig the corpse up, I also have to find enough dry wood to get a proper fire going. It always stops snowing after I have enough firewood, so I can dig a proper fire pit and burn the corpse. The faceless mourner, often, not always, pulls out a notepad at this point, scribbles something down on it, and tears the page away, handing it to me. He always writes things like, "Bundle up, Jeremiah, you'll catch cold," or "I'm making cocoa, do you want some?" I was going to accept on the cocoa, but whenever I look up from reading them, he's gone. In spring, the burial takes place in a light rain. The faceless mourner stands above a corpse, floating face down in a puddle of rainwater. About these corpses, the winter and spring ones don't seem to have any wounds betraying their cause of death. If I had to guess, I'd say they froze or drowned. But why would they be under a foot of snow or lying down in a puddle? Anyway, this burial is the easiest because I can just dig a hole in the wet dirt and lay the poor soul to rest there. I usually put together a few boards or something as a grave marker. When I do make grave markers, the faceless mourner walks over to them and pins on a note from his notepad. The things he writes are really odd. It seems he makes up his own causes of death. Here are some examples. Here lies Uriel, died of sadness. Here lies Meredith. I tried to help her. He didn't. And, oddly enough, here lies Ben. I'm not quite sure where he went. I'll find him eventually. I'm not sure whether he means spiritually or physically. But after pinning the note there, he nods at it and just sort of stands there until I look away. When I do, he disappears. The fall burials are probably my second to least favourite. The mourner knocks on my door. If I open it, he walks away and motions to follow. If I don't, he won't go away. When I follow him, he leads me to a grove of trees that's never there except in the fall. The corpse is always hanging from a tree. There's always a sticky note pinned to it. It always says, "Do you feel guilt?" I always do. I don't know why, because these are people I don't really know. I vaguely remember some of them being mean to me a while ago, maybe a few years at the latest. But I never wished Mrs. Rossetti, my third grade math teacher, dead. I certainly never hoped I'd find her here, hanging from a tree. The corpses are always on the higher branches, and I have to cut them down to bury them. The soil is still good, so I can usually do it. I normally just bury them in the forest. But one time I did that and found the corpse in the tree again, so I took it into the yard. It was obvious how they died, but the thing is, how do the corpses get up there? The taller trees are around 20 feet, and the mourner doesn't seem like the tree climbing with a corpse type. A more obvious question would be, where does the forest come from or go? But I can't even begin to get into that one. The summer burials are the worst. Easily the worst. I retch thinking of them in May. I can't sleep more than a few minutes of the last night or week before June. During the summer burials, the ground is cracked like it would be in a desert. All of the grass is gone, and the few trees that are left are dead. The sun is so strong, I actually have to put on sunblock, or I'll get burned so badly I won't be able to walk the next day. The mourner stands over a decomposing corpse that's been gruesomely murdered. The wounds range from bullets to the head to having had their stomach ripped open and all their organs stuffed down their throat. The mourner writes a note preemptively, pinning it to the corpses. They always have an accusatory tone, saying things like monster, unforgiven, and repent. I don't understand what he means by this. I've never hurt anyone in my life, and now this monster starts bringing corpses onto my property and blames me for their deaths. The third time this happened, I tried to punch him in the face, but with inhuman reflexes, he batted my hand out of the way with his umbrella, striking so fast that he almost broke my wrist. I can't bury the corpse in the summer. The ground is too hard. Thankfully, the trees are all dead, so I can use them for easy firewood. The bad part is the smell. It smells like every dead thing in the world, combined into one big dead thing. And I decided that I needed to vomit right then. I always did. The first time, it took me 4 tries to stop. When I finally did, I looked up and noticed the mourner offering me a flask. I knew that whatever he had in there wasn't water. I didn't care. I just needed to get the smell of corpse out of my nose and the taste of bile out of my mouth. I grabbed it and took a long swig. It's hard to describe the taste. It tasted not so much like apples as it did apple peels. It hardly tasted like anything, with a crisp aftertaste. Right then, it could have been ditch water, and I still would have drank the whole thing. I handed the flask back to him. He put it in his suit and left in the way he's accustomed, by not leaving until I don't watch him leave. The burials come about once a month, although I've had 2 before. I've never had 2 in the summer, fortunately. This has been going on for what I've counted out to be about 2 years. I've buried or burned almost 100 people now, I think. This is all I have. I know it sounds fake, but please, I need help. Does anyone know if I've been cursed, or if I'm being haunted? I know there's no logical explanation for this. If you know anything that could help me, please contact me immediately. I'll leave you with this letter that I got back from Isaac about the summer burials. Isaac, please just tell me something. I need to know about what I'm dealing with. Why is summer so messed up? Please just help me. Jerry. Jeremiah. Summer is a painful time for us all. The ground heats up, and we can feel his anger and hatred from the deep below. Thou may not remember now, but thou buried me. I wish greatly that thou had not. The ground would not be such a terrible place, were it not for the song he doth sing. The song is one of hatred and black malice. It hath no words I can recognise, save one, Jeremiah, and it bodes not well for thou. The word is thine own name, Jeremiah. I will pray for you, but it will do nothing now. Isaac. Life was simpler then. I lived in a quaint little house at the end of an innocent little cul-de-sac, right across from the main road. Everything I could ever want was at the edge of my fingertips. Any food could be found at one of our 3 farms, fresh marts or convenience stores. Any sports gear could be found at Joe McGee's Sports Emporium. Anything, whether necessary or merely desired, could be located, at most, a few miles away. Despite this, my mind would still wander on occasion. I'd become curious a bit too curious for some people's liking. You see, unlike many others in the community, I wasn't ready to just pretend that the world before never existed. Though fleeting by the day, memories of a bygone era fastened themselves to my consciousness. 12 years had passed since, leaving 5 to misremember. But just as I would notice the degradation of my recollection, I'd hone in on the finest details. An auburn leaf dancing towards a jagged sea of yellow and green, brittle and misshapen, yet subsequently immaculate in its descent. The bittersweet tang of my father's coffee, the temperature of which intermittently singeing my tongue upon every sip I snuck. Needless to say, I was different. I was far more terrified of forgetting than I was of remembering. Every night, just as the sun began to set, I'd venture off to the edge of the dome, away from the saccharine reality that we'd all conformed to, away from the imitation trees and plastic dreams, to journey into the real world, albeit with my mind performing most of the work. I'd sit there at the edge of the transparent dome, recalling images of life before the war, before humanity was irreparably maimed. Visions of what once were family and friends dancing along to a tune oh so welcoming to longing ears. Children playing baseball on an open field filled with real grass. However, those phantoms were but a fugitive thought to a weary mind, as looking out into the foreboding, barren wasteland I once called home only further roused apparitions of barbarity, destruction and anarchy. Regardless, those few seconds of joy, even knowing of the desolate backdrop behind them, made the experience worthwhile. My ability to recall certain memories faded over time, but I could always vividly remember the day we were rushed into the dome. My parents were very influential people before the war, and knew of the world's imminent, unavoidable expiration months before it occurred. Thus, when plans for a superdome, a habitat for an exclusive selection of humanity's survivors, was announced, they did all they could to send me in. The price to get one person into the dome was astronomical. Getting 3 would be impossible. Even given my parents' incredible wealth at the time, they knew that they could barely afford 1 ticket, let alone 2 or 3. So they secured my safety at the sacrifice of their own. I was only about 7 years old at the time, and I couldn't fully comprehend the enormity of the circumstances. All I knew was that Mum and Dad were going on a vacation for a little while, and I got to stay in some extravagant hotel. Of course, when the bombs dropped, I was exposed to the ghastly reality of my situation. Fortunately, entry into the dome was well worth the asking price. As marketed, those who were granted admission were, in fact, the last surviving humans on Earth. The world outside was now too hazardous and defiled for human existence, so exiting the dome was a death wish, assuming such a feat would even be possible. The dome was sealed shut on all ends, with nothing but an emergency exit that could supposedly withstand any blast, weapon or temperature. The sole method of exit would be to utilize a key card that was only given to the highest ranking officials and gold member officers. This door would only be used under 2 circumstances: if a member of the community was facing exile, or if there was a catastrophic breach within the dome. In the rare event that there was such a breach, and the door was opened. All gold member households contained life suits that would allow the person wearing the suit to survive healthily for up to 6 months in the foreboding wasteland on the outside. Luckily, given their multitude of connections, my parents were able to secure me a gold membership, hoping that I'd then be safe under any and all circumstances. My childhood essentially consisted of lessons in how to be a functioning member of the community, the dome's cruciality in my survival, and the consequences of disobedience within. Although not prohibited, it was not advised to go near the outer limits of the dome, as the transparent structure could serve as nothing more than a bleak reminder of our traumatic past, according to the officials in charge. Honestly, I can't blame them for claiming that either, as a lot of people's mental states were deteriorating even without the constant reminders. Many inhabitants had gone through episodes of nomadic fever, as it's put, which in minor cases is nothing more than a passing bout of lunacy. But in more severe cases, it's a permanent illness that can lead to a plethora of consequences. It's not exactly known why this sickness occurs. Perhaps a combination of being confined to a dome and the constant reliance on near palpable, artificial air can do a number on a person's psyche. One day, your neighbour Jim is your best friend. The next, he's trying to raid your house with a butcher knife, claiming that God has spoken to him. The only consistent symptom of the sickness is a tendency to incessantly ramble about forgotten people, though doctors always attributed this to delusion, speculating that those afflicted experience hallucinations of deceased loved ones as their condition develops, similar to what many people claim to witness on the brink of death. Everyone knew someone who'd suffered from the sickness, and only the luckiest among them knew survivors. Whether mentally stable or not, if you were considered a major threat to society, you were either executed or exiled from the community. As there was no prison system in place, this was just the easiest method of dealing with criminals and other threats. If you were lucky and didn't commit too heinous of a crime, you were executed in a relatively quick fashion. However, if you were a severe offender, you were exiled. At one point, I bore witness to the normally secretive expulsion procedure. It was late, far past curfew, and being out at this hour, especially with the goal of witnessing an exile, was an act that could lead to massive consequences. However, with all of the talk and all of the warnings since my first years in the dome, I had to see it with my own eyes, at least once. After word had spread about a murder spree committed by James Truefendale, and the verdict on his impending expulsion was announced, I knew I had a chance. I camped out by the official's office and waited for James's release from his cell. After a mechanical buzz and a shrill metallic clang, 3 men wearing life suits promptly walked out with James and carried him to the outermost western part of the dome. There wasn't a single light shining within any house or any lamp upon any street, therefore allowing my secrecy to be maintained. James was dragged out, confined to chains that were clamped far too tight for even the slightest bit of comfort, let alone circulation, as even from a distance, the otherwise inconspicuous veins in his arms shot out like wires. As he was being hauled, he was spewing every cuss in the book. How any family was able to stay asleep during this period is a mystery in itself. The trek to the dome's exit took about 15 minutes, the entirety of which was filled with obscenities and prophecies of forgotten people knowing the truth and that they will return. Hiding, I watched as the 3 suited officials walked into a secluded room containing the exit. I wasn't able to see what went on inside the room. I was only able to witness James being forcefully thrown out into the wasteland and the ensuing aftermath. After James was thrown out, the 3 officers nonchalantly strolled back to their office and didn't even pay James a passing glance. I kept my eyes fixated on him though, waiting for any noticeable changes. James immediately rose to his feet and seemingly desperately pleaded for his life. He banged his fists against the walls of the dome, bawling hysterically with the most immensely terrified expression I've ever seen in a man's eyes. Upon realizing his begging was to no avail, he began to continuously ram himself into the walls of the dome, whipping his head onto the structure until he had a crimson mask. I struggled to watch. He then abruptly began coughing and spluttering violently until he fell to the ground and started shaking as if he was having a seizure. His skin began to bubble, then pop, leading to splatters of blood and pus that dripped down the side of the dome. He attempted to stand up and prevent further masses of skin from boiling away, but he'd collapse soon after, the skin on his legs pooling off like butter under a blowtorch. His screams were inaudible due to the soundproof walls, but the sight of his jaw agape and of the flesh on his face melting from the bone made the sound of screaming ring within my head. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Whether I was paralyzed with fear or simply going mad, I couldn't look away. The bloodied heap of flesh that remained slowly turned pitch black, almost as if it had been charred to the core, with red spots appearing all over, encompassing much of his remaining flesh, bone, and near liquefied skin. Though he was now unable to maneuver his jaw to scream, the frantic movement of James's eyes illustrated to me that he remained both alive and suffering. Refusing to witness any more, I scurried back to my house undetected. As you'd expect, I managed not a wink of sleep that night and became petrified at the thought of life, or lack thereof, outside of the dome. It took me a few months to regain the courage to venture back to the edge, as eventually the urge to live in the past took hold yet again. Out of what I can only amount to morbid curiosity, I eventually returned to the scene. James's body was nowhere to be found. So there I sat, every night as the sun set, trying to expel dark memories and rejoice with the jovial ones. A constant battle, over and over again. I did this for years, until one fateful night when everything changed. I sat down on what they called a tree, aimlessly peering into the abyss, when I noticed something amid the encompassing darkness. Although hard to make out, I spotted a handprint upon the wall of the dome. Perplexed, I climbed down the tree and cautiously ambled over to the print. It was dusty and disfigured. There was something off about it, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. I'd never seen a marking on the walls, as every substance that touched it either bounced, dripped, or slid off without leaving a trace. Naturally, I was confused and attempted to wipe it away. I did this a few times, yet nothing happened. It was at this moment that I realized something that broke me to my core. I realised that the handprint came from outside. Bewildered, I staggered backward and darted all the way back to my house and into my bedroom, trying to convince myself that I was merely in a part of some twisted dream. Eventually, my heart rate slowed, my eyes grew heavy, and I was able to force myself to drift into sleep. I awoke the next morning, not even greeting my foster parents, and ran out towards the edge of the dome. However, my vision was obscured by a cloud of dust. It seemed as though a dust storm had struck, making the entire dome enveloped within a cloud of dirt. After about 30 minutes of desperate searching for the handprint, I gave up and rationalised that it must have actually been a dream. It was at this moment, though, that I saw a handprint form yet again, this time right before my eyes. I walked over to it, a mix of fear and anxiety brewing within me. This one handprint turned into 2, then 3, then 4, and so on, until an entire patch of the dome's western perimeter was covered in grimy, malformed handprints of all shapes and sizes. Not only was a portion of the wall covered, but the ceiling of the dome was too. And the sudden darkness caused a small crowd to survey the blockage. Classes were let out early that day, and officials began surrounding it, barricading any citizens from entering the immediate proximity. Officers began trying to figure out how the handprints were formed, along with how to remove them, as the mere sight of them was causing mass hysteria. Time appeared of the essence, as every few minutes or so, a new handprint would creep into the picture. Officials began sending out officers in life suits to attempt to remove the prints from the outside. Not a single officer who ventured on this expedition returned. With their tattered life suits coated in a variety of bodily fluids, being mockingly thrown back with each dispatch, though this was kept confidential to the public. The line was drawn, and officers ceased to be released when one life suit was returned intact, save for the notable absence of a key card. On the second day, we, as the public, realised that this was no ordinary dust storm. It had been 24 hours, and the dust had still yet to settle. Our vision was still obscured from the inside, and if not for our ability to tell the time, we'd have no idea if it was day or night. More concerning, however, was that in this span of time, another collection of handprints completely covered half of the dome, leading towards the exit door. When the third day struck, all of our livestock either went insane or dropped dead for no identifiable reason. Fearing the worst, my foster family, much like many others, stored and gathered as much food as they could. Markets were ransacked, and there weren't nearly enough officers or officials to stop the rioting. The dome was in a perpetual state of dusk, the only source of light coming from the dim sunlight that just barely forced its way through the cloud of dust and the spaces between fingers. The handprints had completely covered the dome. On the fourth day, we were greeted by the wailing shriek of sirens. All electricity was cut out from the dome, and it appeared as though the dust had thickened, along with the handprints seemingly layering onto each other, leaving the entire dome shrouded in shadow. All families were instructed to remain inside of their houses as the sirens softened, and a message was broadcasted to every radio in the community, the only piece of technology that appeared to be working. Feeling that this message would be of dire importance, I wrote down what was spoken. The following message is transmitted at the request of the officials in the Mender City Dome. This is not a drill. There is an imminent threat to the community in the form of... It was at this point that the message audibly degraded and became incomprehensible. The only thing breaking the silence of the dome was the static being emitted from the radio and the occasional jarring scream in the distance. After a few moments, the radio queued back up again, and an unnatural, raspy voice took hold. The speaker's voice was airy, ghostly even, and it painstakingly uttered every syllable of every word, while wheezing and breathing heavily, almost as if through debris, making sure to articulate their message perfectly so it could be heard over the ever-present white noise. The speaker stated, "You believe that we were gone, that we'd vanished away into the darkest recesses of your mind, a faded memory, a lost cause. You believe that we'd been whisked away at the cruel hands of light, of power, of warfare. You may have been right in that regard. We left you to fend for yourselves, as you did to us. Whether erased years gone, or expelled from your serenity, we let you know now. We have returned." The radio clip ended. The static ceased. Shocked, paralysed, petrified. There wasn't a single noise coming from any household, save for the occasional whimper or gasp. Suddenly, the radio cut back in again. The static resumed, but among the static, we heard the sound of a heavy door creaking open, then a metallic slam, along with the sound of an army of footsteps trudging forth. The radio cut out again. Much like many others, my foster parents shot upstairs and grabbed our life suits. I quickly put it on, knowing that the exit door had been breached and that contaminated air was now pervading throughout our dome. We began barricading our doors, but then rationalised that if whatever was out there could get past the exit door, they could easily get past a few wooden planks and couches. I began scavenging for any weapons throughout the house, but seeing as guns were prohibited, I had to fend for myself using a measly steak knife. My family and I went into hiding, finding solace within our attic, the safest place we had in our house. The room contained nothing but a desk to the far right, a set of chairs, a spare radio, and a tinted window near the roof. We all huddled beneath the desk, praying to any god we could think of, and planning an escape route if need be. All we could hear from outside our house were blood-curdling screams, the sound of liquid hitting concrete, and the crackling of fire. The radios turned back on. Once again, nothing was audible, apart from the sound of static. This persisted for a few minutes, until the static changed to a rather cheery tune, almost as if whatever was out there was mocking us. I recognised the song from my earliest days, and amidst the chaos, I even chuckled a bit. On loop, Mr. Sandman by the Chordettes began playing, one of my favourite songs from my childhood back before the war. That moment of joy, however, didn't last. As soon, the song looped over so many times that it felt like we were going deaf. We sat there for hours with nothing but the sound of screaming and that damn 50s song pummeling our ears. Eventually, My curiosity got the best of me yet again. Slowly, I crept over to the tinted window and peered out into the ensuing anarchy. I was revolted by what I saw. Bodies thrown about, torn to bits within the streets. Tarred black corpses speckled in red, lining the sidewalks. With bodily fluids of all types, painting buildings in the distance like demented graffiti. The neighbourhood next to mine was in the midst of being ravaged by a militia of lost souls, and I knew that mine was next. I stepped away from the window, stricken with fear, and speechless from the chaos ensuing before my eyes. I slowly sat down yet again, next to my parents. Concerned, they looked at each other and rose up, cautiously walking towards the window. They both stared out that window for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, they both turned back and gazed at me, expressionless and with a mile-wide look in their eyes, almost as if neither one of them was all there anymore. Looking back at them, I noticed something. My father began to smirk. That smirk turned into a grin, and that grin turned into a sickening, devilish smile. He had a look in his eyes, different than any other I've ever seen on a person. He looked over at my mother, and then over at me, his eyes darting in all directions. He then began walking towards me, more jolting than anything. It looked almost as if with every step, he was attempting to dislodge a bone in his body. He stood before me, same maniacal grin on his face. "Dear, be a doll and give Daddy your weapon, okay?" I wasn't in the right frame of mind. No one was. I remained motionless, a surge of thoughts flying through my head like a bullet through a flock of doves. I dropped my knife to the floor, not able to respond in any other way. My father picked up the knife, toyed with it a bit, like a child would with a Christmas present, and slit my mother's throat. I watched as this happened, not moving a muscle, and even worse, not caring. Blood spurted out of her neck like a faucet, the liquid getting on my suit and staining my soul. My father fell with her to the ground, tears streaming from his eyes, yet his smile remained. He looked over at me, apologised, and then did the honours by slitting his own neck. I looked down at their corpses, not saddened, not traumatised, hell, not even fazed. Eventually, I dragged myself to the tinted window, not willing to even glance at my foster parents' dishevelled bodies and ignoring the stench of death. So there I sat, watching as my neighbourhood was torn apart limb from limb by an army of pitch black, red-spotted carcasses, all deformed in different ways. It felt as though time had froze. I could see the world, yet nothing but chaos remained. I studied the grisly scene with my eyes, the last sight I believed I'd ever see. An army of tarred black carcasses, speckled red, tore through people's houses, each member looking different than the rest. All of them had a few distinct similarities. They all had beady, bloodshot eyes that could stare into the soul of even the most steadfast of individuals. All appeared to have unnatural strength, along with the tendency to spew an acidic substance out of their mouths, that, as far as I could tell, melt any metal, fabric, or piece of flesh. Many had mutations, such as extra arms, sharpened claws for hands, or even no hands at all. Others had abnormally large legs and used them to stomp through their prey's heads. Many were capable of climbing or walking on walls, whether sideways or completely upside down, defying all known laws of physics. The only other thing I noticed was they weren't slaughtering us for food, as I never saw them devour any human flesh. They were doing it for fun. They were relentless in their ways and showed absolutely no remorse or mercy. They had vengeance on their minds, or at least what was left of them. I sat there at the window, waiting for the forced entry of my home, waiting for the sweet release of death. I shut my eyes, expecting to hear the sweet sound of my door breaking down and of my stairs being trudged upon. Yet nothing happened. There was complete silence for the first time, save for the sound of Mr. Sandman bludgeoning my ears like a sledgehammer. I opened my eyes and directed my attention outside. The entire army parked themselves in front of my house, watching my every move. I looked down at them, finally accepting my fate, and motioned for them to get my death over with. Yet once again, nothing happened. They just stood there, staring at me with beady, bloodshot eyes. They remained there, not budging for hours, and I realised that they were waiting me out, forcing me to come to them, knowing that I didn't have enough food to survive forever. We were locked in a stalemate, but I wasn't going to just give up and give them that satisfaction. They were going to have to wait it out with me, and even if I was prolonging the inevitable, it at least made me feel as though I got the last laugh. Now we're here. I've sat in this attic for days now, surviving off of nothing but canned beans and fruit. The only way I've been able to keep my sanity has been writing this. At least now, I have something to do with myself. Something to preoccupy me from taking that steak knife and plunging it into my chest. Even if that means writing this memoir over and over again. Every now and then, I'll look out of my window at that unforgiving army and drift off into thought. I look back at my fondest memories and remember how even in the wake of chaos and after all of the adversity we'd all faced, life was simpler then. For more terrifying creepypasta horror stories, check out the playlist or the video on screen.